Alongside formal historical inscriptions, another rich source exists for understanding the Babylonian Pantheon. This comes from vast collections of temple records and legal documents that survive from both the early and later periods of Babylonian history. Excavations at sites such as Tello, Tel Sefer, and Abu Haba have yielded tens of thousands of tablets, many of them belonging to temple archives. These texts record offerings made to temples, commercial transactions, legal agreements, and official oaths, and they frequently mention the gods. In these documents, divine names appear in several important ways. Gods are invoked in oaths to guarantee honesty, called upon as witnesses to legal acts, or named to prevent disputes from being reopened. Lists of temple offerings constantly include divine recipients, and since many economic activities were closely tied to temples, the gods naturally appear throughout the records. Personal names also provide valuable evidence, since most names were formed by combining a human element with the name or title of a deity. Together, these sources add depth to our understanding of the Babylonian religious world. A clear distinction must be made between gods who actively appear in temple lists and legal formulas, and those who are known only through personal names. Deities who are directly invoked in rituals, oaths, or offerings belonged to the living and active pantheon of their time. If such gods are absent from royal inscriptions or historical narratives, this is best explained by gaps in surviving material rather than by their insignificance. Legal documents, in this respect, are just as reliable as formal historical texts. The situation is different when gods appear only as elements within names. Naming traditions were often conservative, and a deity might continue to appear in names long after their worship had declined or disappeared. Some names preserve the memory of local gods whose influence never extended beyond a single city or region. Others include beings that occupied a low rank in the religious hierarchy, closer to spirits or demons than to major gods. In addition, many gods were known by descriptive titles as well as by their proper names, and these titles sometimes replaced the original name in personal names. As a result, a deity might appear under an attribute rather than a familiar divine name. Examples from later legal documents show how well-known gods could appear under alternate designations connected to healing, the sun, or the West. When the tablets from the earliest period are examined, the same major gods found in historical inscriptions appear again. These include Enlil, Bau, Sin, Ningirsu, Ningishzida, Ninmar, Nana, Nina, and others. It is likely that further publication of early temple archives will reveal a few additional minor deities, though probably not many. One striking feature of these early records is the divine honor given to certain former rulers toward the end of the first period. Kings such as Gudea and Dungi received offerings alongside the gods, had sanctuaries dedicated to them, and were treated with a level of reverence usually reserved for divine beings. This shows that the boundary between kingship and divinity could become blurred in Babylonian religious practice. In the documents from the second period, oaths are most often sworn in the names of Marduk, Shamash, Ea, Raman, and Sin. Usually 2 or 3 gods are named together, and the reigning king is often added to increase the solemnity of the oath. Other deities appear in dating formulas, where years are named after particular gods, likely reflecting special honors given to them at the time. Ninmar appears during the reign of Hammurabi as the daughter of Marduk, showing how divine family relationships continued to develop. Several gods appear for the first time in this period. One of them, Kusha, is mentioned alongside major gods in connection with temple gates, where judges held court, suggesting a position of real importance, even though nothing certain is known about this deity's origin or character. Another, Nungal, whose name means great chief, had a temple in Sippar. His identity seems to have been overshadowed by the dominant sun god of that city, and descriptions portray him as a fierce or raging deity, hinting at solar qualities. Over time, gods like this lost their independent status as stronger deities absorbed their functions. Yet their names did not disappear completely. Nungal eventually became the name of a group of powerful demons, showing how former gods could descend into the realm of spirits while retaining a measure of authority. Zamama is another deity who emerges in legal documents from the time of Hammurabi. The construction of a sanctuary for him and his consort was significant enough to give its name to a year. Hymns describe him as part of the divine circle surrounding Marduk, and scholarly texts identify him as a solar deity worshipped in the city of Kish. At times, he was even equated with Ninib. His temple in Kish bore a name that emphasized martial glory, making it clear that Zamama was understood as a god of war. His consort is simply referred to as the Lady, a common and general title. In cases like this, the absence of such gods from historical narratives seems accidental rather than meaningful, and further discoveries would naturally bring them into clearer view. Personal names preserve an even broader range of divine figures. Most major gods appear frequently, though some, like Anu, are notably rare or absent in names. Alongside the well-known gods, a number of lesser or purely local deities appear only in naming traditions. These include goddesses tied to specific cities, alternative forms of healing deities, fire-related figures, and even a serpent god. Almost all of these can be understood as local manifestations of ideas already represented by better-known gods. Lists compiled by Babylonian scholars show that the number of named deities was enormous, reaching into the thousands. These lists were likely based on temple inventories and legal documents, which explains why so many divine names survived, even when their cults had little real importance. Most of these deities lived on mainly through their presence in personal names, serving as echoes of local traditions and forgotten beliefs, rather than as central figures in Babylonian religion. Returning to the historical records and gathering together the lesser deities mentioned in the inscriptions of Hammurabi and the rulers who followed him up to the restoration of native Babylonian kings, a group of minor gods can be identified. These figures appear alongside the great gods, but never reach the same level of authority or influence. The surviving material from this period is limited, so the list cannot represent the full range of lesser divine beings still known at the time. Even so, when compared with the earlier period, a clear pattern emerges. During the age shaped by Hammurabi's reforms, Babylonian religion shows a strong movement toward simplification. Many local cults were absorbed into larger ones, and numerous minor gods lost their independence and were pushed to the margins of religious life, often slipping into the category of spirits or demons rather than remaining full deities. Most of these minor gods are known only by name, with little information about their character or function. Some reappear in later Assyrian or Neo-Babylonian texts. Others surface in hymns or incantations, while a few are found only in this specific historical phase. Since new material continues to appear, it is unsafe to judge a god's importance solely by how often a name occurs. One such deity is Zakar, whose name likely carried the sense of heroic strength. He seems to have been worshipped in Nippur, where a city wall was dedicated to him during the reign of Samsu-Iluna. Because this wall was sacred to the goddess Belit, Zakar was probably closely connected to the main divine family of Nippur and may have belonged to the inner circle of gods associated with the Great Bell. Another wall in the same city was dedicated to a god whose name is uncertain, but includes the element meaning king. This element appears in several divine names and titles, often associated with Nergal, the god of war and destruction. A number of other minor deities appear together at the end of a royal inscription, where they are called upon to curse anyone who might violate a decree. Some of these gods were likely imported from the Kassite tradition and held only temporary importance in Babylonia. This is especially clear in the case of Shukamuna, who is described as the divine ancestor of a Kassite king. Babylonian scholars later equated him with Nergal, seeing him as a god of war who embodied the fierce and destructive power of the midday sun. His consort Shumalia was honored as the Lady of the Shining Mountains, reinforcing their foreign and mountainous origin. Other figures in this group can be understood as titles or special forms of well-known gods. Nindimsu appears as a title of Ea in his role as patron of crafts and skills. Belit Ekali, meaning the Lady of the Palace, is associated with Ninib and seems to represent Gula under a particular title. This reflects the ancient habit of playing with divine names and titles, since names were believed to carry deep meaning and power. Such wordplay was common and reflects a worldview in which names were closely tied to destiny and essence. It is also possible that the term palace referred symbolically to the underworld, which would suit Gula's role as a goddess who restores life and mediates between death and renewal. Pap Yu stands out as a particularly interesting figure. He is described as the offspring of the earth and as the lord of boundaries. This suggests that he was a protective boundary god, guarding land and property. While many cultures preserved powerful boundary gods, Babylonian religion increasingly assigned these functions to spirits and demons rather than full gods. These beings were symbolized on boundary stones with images such as serpents and scorpions, marking land ownership and warning against violations. Pap Yu appears in such a context, invoked alongside many major gods, and likely represents a survival from an older stage of belief when boundaries were protected by specialized deities. Among all the minor gods of this period, Gula is the most significant and best defined. She is the consort of Ninib and appears clearly in inscriptions from the time of Nebuchadnezzar I. Her name also appears frequently in personal names, showing that her worship was firmly established at an early date. Gula's role is that of a life-giver in the broadest sense. She is a divine healer who preserves health, removes disease, and restores life. She has power over both healing and harm, able to cure sickness or inflict it. Because of this dual power, she is even addressed as a creator of humanity. Yet her role is unique. She does not fully belong to the gods of the underworld, nor solely to the gods of the living. Instead, she stands between these realms, linking death and renewal. Other deities mentioned in the same royal inscriptions were local gods tied to small towns that never gained lasting importance. Some names simply reflect alternative titles for major goddesses, used to distinguish them from others with similar roles. As the narrative reaches the time of Nabu-Balidin, The question arises whether certain gods should still be considered part of the earlier Babylonian pantheon. The fact that some of them appear in religious literature and personal names from earlier centuries suggests that they were not late inventions. This is clearly the case with Malik and Buneni, who formed a triad with Shamash in the great sun temple of Sippar. Both names occur already in the time of Hammurabi. Malik means ruler and was often used as a title for Shamash, though it also came to represent a distinct divine figure. Artistic representations from this period show Shamash seated in his shrine, with a wheel before him guided by two figures identified as Malik and Bunene. These figures act as attendants who guide the sun's fiery course across the sky. Through this close association, Bunene became the consort of Malik, illustrating the Babylonian tendency to arrange divine beings in pairs. Originally, Malik may have been a local form of the sun god, later absorbed into the greater cult of Shamash, while still retaining a secondary role. A different type of divine figure appears with Nin Igi Nangarbu, Gushkin Banda, Nin Kura, and Nin Zadim. These beings are connected to Ea, who was regarded as the divine source of craftsmanship and artistic skill. By the time of Nabubal-Iddin, artistic work had become highly specialized, and this specialization was reflected in religion. Each branch of craft was assigned a patron figure. One presided over metalworkers, another over those who worked precious metals, another over stone quarrying, and another over sculpture. Ea stood above them as the ultimate source of wisdom and skill. These figures are not gods in the traditional sense. They are personifications of human abilities, created to express the belief that skill and creativity ultimately come from the divine. Granting them divine status was simply the only way this idea could be expressed within Babylonian thought. In this way, new divine figures continued to appear even at a late stage of Babylonian religion, though they differed greatly from the ancient gods of nature and power. This development reflects a more advanced society shaped by growing artistic ambition and technical skill. This artistic impulse was especially strong during the period when Assyria was rising to power. Assyrian rulers placed enormous value on monumental art as a way to project strength and glory. Sculpture and metalwork flourished during this time, and the influence of Assyrian culture spread southward. The reign of Nabubal-Iddin falls within this era, and from this point onward, Assyrian influence can be seen not only in art and culture, but also, to a limited extent, in the religious ideas of southern Mesopotamia. Assyrian influence played only a small role in keeping alive the belief in the countless spirits that stood beside the major and minor gods. The stronger reason was the deep conservatism of popular religion, which tends to survive even when official theology changes. Everyday experience was still explained through unseen forces. Human actions, emotions, sudden misfortunes, and strange turns of fate were widely believed to be guided by visible and invisible powers. Even though scholars tried to organize the divine world into a clearer system, the older spirit-based worldview did not disappear. In popular thought, an untamed multitude of spirits continued to dominate, especially in prayers, magical texts, origin stories, and epic narratives. These writings introduce hundreds of spirits and assign them different roles, even if many of those roles remain unclear today because the evidence is incomplete. Extra clues come from personal names that include spirit names and from lists compiled by learned writers who drew on older texts. When those lists contain short explanations, a clearer picture begins to emerge. One key detail is how these spirits are marked in writing. In many sources, spirit names are preceded by the same sign used for gods. Because both gods and spirits share this marker, it can be hard to tell the difference between them. This is not an accident. It points to a shared origin. A god can be understood as a spirit that has grown in rank and power. Much of Babylonian religious development is the gradual separation of major gods from the wider sea of spirits. That separation began long before written records and continued for centuries without ever becoming fully complete. Official inscriptions mainly recognize the major gods, but popular religion kept a strong belief in demons and spirits, whether helpful, harmful, or indifferent. Hundreds appear in magical writings, and many more in other religious texts. These spirits can be grouped in broad categories. One large group consists of spirits believed to cause disease and physical suffering. People sought protection from them through spoken formulas thought to carry special force and through cleansing or expiatory rituals. Another group consists of spirits believed to inhabit fields and wild land, imagined as the hidden owners of the soil. Serpents and scorpions were favorite symbols for these beings. When land was taken into use, the spirits of the place had to be appeased. Landowners tried to secure protection by placing themselves under these powers and calling on them to defend property rights. When land was acquired through a royal grant or unusual circumstances, it was common to set up a stone marker describing the owner's claim and warning against intrusion. These markers often ended with appeals to major gods to curse anyone who violated the boundary. They also carried carved images of animals and fantastic creatures. These figures likely served as visible signs of the spirits, meant to frighten intruders and strengthen the warning. A further group of spirits was linked to the realm of the dead. These beings were imagined as haunting burial places and the hidden regions where the dead gathered. Some ancient images portray them as mixed creatures, part human and part animal, designed to look grotesque and terrifying. Yet their power was not unlimited. They were subject to the authority of underworld gods, especially Nergal and his consort Alatu. In later Babylonian thinking about the afterlife, demons played a smaller role than the ruling gods of the underworld. The dead were believed to depend mainly on the favor of those gods. Even so, underworld demons were thought to rise into the world of the living to bring harm, and people used the same protective rituals against them as against sickness demons. There was also another kind of spirit belief connected to skilled work and creativity. Craftsmanship and intellectual achievement were often explained as the result of hidden powers at work. This may seem surprising, but many people did not attribute every detail of human skill directly to the greatest gods. Ea and Nabu were seen as patrons of wisdom in general, yet the fine details of crafts and professions were often left to secondary powers. As a result, many lesser forces were believed to oversee different kinds of handiwork and mental skill. Among all these spirits, one set of names stands out because it appears constantly in historical, ritual, and religious texts. Babylonian tradition did not only organize the gods into groups, it also tried to organize the spirits. From this tendency came the idea of two great spirit collectives that represented the secondary powers of heaven and earth in a broad way, somewhat like the way the highest gods were used to summarize the greatest divine powers. These two groups were called the Anunnaki and the Igigi. The meaning of Anunnaki remains uncertain. various explanations have been suggested, but none has become fully secure. The name seems to have been shaped in a way that may reflect wordplay, and it also resembles names linked to the sky god Anu. Igigi is easier to understand. The name is connected to a word family, meaning strong, and the traditional writing of the term also presents them as powerful chiefs. This makes it likely that both group names carry the same basic idea: the strong ones. In some texts, the Igigi are called 7, but the number is used more as a symbol of a great group than as a strict count. Other traditions speak of 5 instead, showing again that the numbers function as symbolic totals. These groups appear in an early historical inscription of an Assyrian king, where the Igigi are associated with the heavens and the Anunnaki with the earth. The way the names are used suggests that at a very early stage, they covered almost the entire realm of unseen powers, and at times the terms may even have included gods as well as spirits. This fits with an early period when the boundary between God and spirit was not sharply defined. In hymns and incantations, these two groups play a major role. Anu is sometimes presented as their father, yet they also serve other major gods such as Bel, Ninib, Marduk, Ishtar, and Nergal. They bow before these greater powers and can even become the target of divine anger. They are described as being sent out on tasks by the gods. Their overall character is stern and often hostile. Their brilliance is said to scorch the land, and their power inspires fear. Assyrian kings especially liked to mention them alongside the major gods when seeking to magnify the aura of royal authority. Official recognition of these two groups continued into the late period. An Assyrian or Babylonian ruler could dedicate an altar to them at a city wall, and offerings could be made to them during major festivals connected with Marduk, who is described as their lord. Hymns also imagine them participating in sacred settings, such as the Great Temple of Marduk, where they are pictured alongside the gods in ritual purity. Texts praise them as shining chiefs, linked to the ancient spiritual heritage of Eridu, showing how these ideas stretched across many centuries of Mesopotamian religious history. Alongside these groups, there was also a separate set of 7 spirits described as evil demons, representing the forces behind physical suffering. These appear mainly in magical texts, and their details belong to the world of ritual protection and healing. The larger point is that popular religion maintained a close bond between gods and spirits. Spirits were not outside the divine world. They belonged within it, and older animistic thinking continued to hold the imagination of the people, even as scholars refined and organized theology. From this point, the focus shifts to the Assyrian period, where the gods named in royal inscriptions reveal how close the Assyrian and Babylonian pantheons were. Lists from Assyrian records include many familiar names, with only a small number that seem unique or foreign. Yet not every name in such lists reflects real worship. Some appear only as ceremonial additions used to give weight to royal inscriptions or to heighten warnings and curses. A smaller core group represents the active divine powers in Assyria, the gods who mattered most in public religion and state ideology. When this Assyrian core is compared with Babylonian religion, 3 patterns stand out. The Assyrian pantheon is smaller, fewer minor deities are brought forward, and very few genuinely new gods appear. The most important exception is Ashur, the one god truly distinctive to Assyria. Without Ashur, the Assyrian and Babylonian divine worlds would look almost the same. The real differences become clearer not in the names alone, but in the balance of power among the gods and in the traits that brought them royal and popular support. In Assyria, the movement toward centralization becomes even stronger than it had been in Babylonia. Babylon had elevated Marduk to the highest position, yet Marduk still existed within a network of other great gods and older traditions. In Assyria, Ashur rises higher still. He stands above the other gods with fewer limits, and his supremacy becomes tightly bound to the identity of the empire itself. When Assyria falls, Ashur fades with it. The cult of Marduk, by contrast, survives political defeat and continues under later rulers. This central position of Ashur also explains why Assyrian royal religion tends to mention fewer minor gods. Ashur is presented as sufficient on his own, a power who needs no long train of divine assistance. Other great gods remain present, because cutting them out would sever Assyria from its ancient heritage, and rulers of vast empires rarely encourage sudden religious upheaval. Yet beside Ashur, these gods often seem to function as members of a small court, adding splendor rather than acting as independent forces. Those who gain real favor often do so because they share Ashur's dominant quality, the strength of war. They become smaller reflections of the same ideal. Ashur begins as the local patron of the city that carried his name, a city on the west bank of the Tigris. Early evidence presents him as a city god rather than a clear embodiment of the sun, the moon, fire, or water. If he later rules over a vast territory, it is because a growing state was seen as an expanded city. As the city of Ashur rose, Ashur became the god of Assyria, much as Marduk became the god of Babylonia when Babylon unified the south. Yet a difference appears. Marduk's worship remained centered in Babylon, while temples to Ashur were established across the Assyrian realm. Ashur traveled with the kings and was honored wherever the royal seat moved, whether to Kala, Nineveh, or other capitals. One likely reason for this mobility is that Ashur was represented not only by statues, but also by a military standard that could be carried into battle. This banner symbolized the god's presence with the army and could be placed wherever the king established his base. The design of this standard reveals important features. It included a winged disc and a warrior figure drawing a bow. The winged disc is widely associated with solar symbolism in the ancient world, which makes it tempting to imagine an early solar aspect to Ashur, even if the texts do not clearly describe him that way. The shift from statue to standard also fits the martial character of Assyrian life and suggests that Ashur became firmly understood as a god of war. The name Ashur becomes inseparable from the city. The city's name appears to come from the god, not the other way around. As Assyria expanded, the god's name also became attached to the land itself. The traditional writing of Ashur's name can be understood as the good god, and the underlying root suggests granting blessing and prosperity. This makes Ashur the god who causes his people to thrive, the good one in the fullest sense. That meaning may have started as a descriptive title rather than the earliest original name, and some traditions hint at another form, Anshar, which could have influenced how Ashur was understood and named over time. Anshar also appears in Mesopotamian creation traditions as a powerful early figure in the divine genealogy, linked to authority among the gods. This raises the possibility that later scholars reshaped older cosmic stories to honor the rising power of Assyria by giving special prominence to a figure whose name could be linked to Ashur. In Mesopotamian religion, such reshaping of ancient myths was common, especially when political power shifted and a new patron god rose to prominence. The push to exalt Ashur can also be traced in parts of Mesopotamian religious storytelling. In one version of the creation tradition, the task of building Ashara, meaning the earth, is credited to Anshar, even though another version gives that role to Marduk. The pattern is clear. Babylonian thinkers had reshaped older ideas to lift Marduk above earlier figures, and writers working under Assyrian influence could just as easily shift the spotlight again by replacing Marduk with a figure linked to the Assyrian supreme god. This helps explain why Anshar begins to look like more than a mythic name. It starts to feel like the true identity behind the god who leads the Assyrian divine order. The earliest Assyrian inscriptions already name Ashur. One of the oldest rulers known, Samsi Ramon, does not yet use the title king. He presents himself instead as a religious leader and proudly calls himself a builder of Ashur's temple. This does not mean the temple was founded at that time, but that repairs or expansions were carried out. The bricks bearing this statement were found at the ruins of the ancient city of Ashur, leaving no doubt about the location being described. Even after Assyrian rulers began calling themselves kings, they often preferred to describe themselves as priests of Ashur. This was not a modest title. It was a declaration that their authority was rooted in service to the god. In the 14th century, the Temple of Ashur suffered damage during conflict with Kassite forces pushing northward. That pressure was turned back by Ramon-Nirari I, who defeated enemies, restored the harmed sections of the temple, and set Assyria on a more aggressive course. From that point forward, warfare became central to Assyrian identity, and dependence on Ashur grew sharper and more intense. Military language in royal records shows how completely the god was fused with the state. Enemies are called enemies of Ashur. The army is Ashur's army. Weapons are Ashur's weapons. Victories are described as Ashur's victories, while the king is only the instrument through whom the god acts. The enemy nations are said to collapse before the terrifying sight of the god, and the brightness of his presence, likely imagined through the shining standard carried into battle, is portrayed as a force that overwhelms opponents with panic. Warfare is described as being carried out in Ashur's name in a literal sense, since crucial decisions were supported by divine guidance, and the god's symbol was believed to be present with the troops. Conquered cities are said to belong first to Ashur, and tribute from defeated peoples is presented as an offering to him. Despite their pride and ambition, Assyrian kings repeatedly portray themselves as humbled before their god. Everything they possess is credited to Ashur. He is described as the one who calls them to the throne, grants them crown and scepter, and secures their rule. Their successes, including expansion across distant lands, are presented as the result of Ashur placing an invincible weapon in their hands, often symbolized by the mighty bow. Some rulers even describe themselves as Ashur's offspring. This does not need to be taken as a literal claim of divine birth. It functions as the strongest expression of loyalty and dependence, a way of saying that their very existence and greatness flow from the god's favor. That phrasing also reveals something important. Fear and awe were central, but affection and devotion were present as well. Royal inscriptions pile up titles for Ashur, calling him the Great Lord who rules the divine assembly, the greatest of all gods, the King of the heavenly host, the Father of the gods, the great rock or mountain, and the King of gods. When other deities are listed beside him, Ashur almost always comes first. There is one rare exception. Ramon-Nirari I once places Anu before Ashur in a list of divine powers credited with victory. This reflects an older stage of Assyrian religion, when Anu held the highest theoretical rank as the supreme sky god and had an established cult even in the city of Ashur. Ashur's rise to absolute primacy begins only when the rulers of the city of Ashur become conquerors. Before that, the northern region still acknowledged the older hierarchy familiar from the south. The turning point comes with the period when Assyria begins to see itself as an empire. After that, Ashur's precedence becomes fixed. Whether he is named with Bel, with Raman, with Shamash, or with a longer list, he is placed first again and again. This history explains why Ashur becomes defined above all as a war god. Whatever his earliest form may have been, his public identity is shaped by conquest. His titles follow naturally from that role. He becomes supreme because he embodies superior force. He is the lawgiver and ruler over gods and spirits, not because of ancient cosmic stories, but because military success is treated as proof of unmatched power. Assyrian kings describe themselves as his priests and lieutenants, acting on his behalf. Ashur becomes the living symbol of Assyria's destiny, and in that sense he is the most distinctive figure of the Assyrian religious world. His influence is so strong that the other gods begin to take on his tone. When possible, their warlike aspects are emphasized. The more a god can be presented as a helper in battle and a breaker of enemies, the more that God attracts royal favor. Many deities start to look like smaller reflections of Ashur, standing beside the greater original. After Ashur, the most important divine figure in Assyria is Ishtar. She is clearly the same great goddess known in Babylonia, closely related to the Ishtar of Uruk. But in Assyria, she appears in several local forms. Texts speak of an Ishtar of Nineveh, an Ishtar of Arbela, and a third Ishtar tied to a specific temple name and sometimes called the Queen of that sanctuary. The historical record makes it hard to decide which form is the oldest. Assyrian rulers themselves seem aware that the goddess came from the south, and early on there is a deliberate effort to stress an Assyrian Ishtar. This suggests that her cult gained new weight when political power shifted toward Nineveh. The forms associated with Arbela and the special Nineveh shrine become prominent in royal texts much later, especially in the reign of Esarhaddon. Arbela may have developed into an important religious center, possibly even known for prophetic activity, but the full story remains uncertain. For practical purposes, the Assyrians treated these forms as one goddess. The same traits and titles surround them all. In royal ideology, Ishtar stands beside Ashur as the great power of battle. This warlike face of the goddess was not invented in Assyria, since even earlier Babylonian traditions show her as fierce and destructive at times. But Assyria pushes this side to the front and allows it to dominate. As the empire expands, she becomes the one who arranges battle lines, strengthens the king's courage, and grants victory. Stories describe her appearing in dreams at moments of crisis, speaking comfort to kings such as Ashurbanipal. When danger rises, the king prays to her as urgently as he prays to Ashur. She is portrayed not only as a royal patron, but as a goddess the people are also expected to honor. Her splendor is described as unmatched, and she is pictured as clothed in flame, sending streams of fire against enemies. She is called mighty over the spirits of the underworld, and her commands are described as irresistible. Even while her gentler roles as giver of abundance, hearer of prayers, and protective mother remain strong in religious poetry, the official historical voice focuses on her battlefield power. Still, the language of devotion sometimes turns affectionate. Some kings describe her as loving the king and his priesthood, and the same language of divine favor that surrounds Ashur also surrounds her. Temples are built for her in major Assyrian cities, and during certain sacred times, the king travels to worship her. At one stage, Ishtar of Arbela seems to gain striking prominence, since Ashurbanipal directs a desperate prayer to her and describes her appearing in a dream to encourage the troops. Yet even then, her local form is not openly placed above the Ishtar of Nineveh when the gods are formally listed. A curious detail appears when an Assyrian text calls Ishtar the wife of Bel. This is not normal in Babylonian tradition. The simplest explanation is confusion created by titles. Belit means lady, and Ishtar is constantly called the Lady of Battle. Once Bel is treated not as a personal name, but as a title meaning lord, it becomes easy for a careless or overbold writer to speak of Belit Ishtar as the consort of Bel. Whether this was only a scribal slip or a real theological idea is uncertain. What is clear is that Ishtar's defining feature is independence. She is not merely a reflection of a male god. She rules in her own right and stands as a true equal beside the great gods. In later Assyrian thinking, her name becomes almost synonymous with goddess. Many other female deities are treated as forms of Ishtar, and she becomes the only goddess who consistently takes an active role in both religious and political life. At the same time, Assyrian kings also honored the older southern cults of Ishtar, especially the one linked to Uruk, restoring temples and recovering captured statues to demonstrate continuity with ancient tradition. Before Ashur's rise, Anu held first place in the northern hierarchy, just as he theoretically remained supreme in the south. His cult was ancient, and he even had a temple in the city of Ashur itself. In Assyria, he keeps the same identity as the sky god and ruler of the spirits of heaven and earth. Over time, however, his cult fades into the background because of Ashur's overwhelming dominance. Even in his own temple, he is no longer worshipped alone. Raman, the storm god, is placed beside him as a partner. Anu survives partly because he belongs to the classic triad with Bel and Ea. In many royal texts, he appears mainly in this formal trio, invoked especially in curses against anyone who might destroy royal monuments or in ceremonial contexts where ancient cosmic order is being emphasized. Dagon is also very old in Assyria. Though known in Babylonia early on, his cult seems to have come south from the north. His name appears in early royal names, and the form closely resembles the Philistine god Dagon. The connection is hard to dismiss. It suggests that the cult may have entered Assyria very early through northern and western movements of peoples. Yet Dagon's identity changes in Assyria. While he is linked to agriculture among the Philistines, in the Assyrian setting he rises high and becomes associated with Anu, with a role tied to the earth. This leads to a blending with the southern figure Bel, and as this blending progresses, Dagon gradually disappears from active worship. By the 9th century, his cult seems to have largely ended, and even personal names containing Dagon fade from use. Shamash also has an ancient place in Assyria. A ruler in the 14th century claims to have built a temple for the sun god in the city of Ashur. In the Assyrian mindset, Shamash stands out as the clearest bearer of ethical ideals. Unlike Ashur and Ishtar, who are portrayed as fiercely loyal to Assyria at any cost, Shamash is imagined as acting according to justice. His support is claimed as a reward for righteousness. Royal inscriptions describe him as judge of heaven and earth, the one who sees guilt and punishes wrongdoing. When kings release captives, they describe doing so in his presence, as though placing the act under the eye of justice. This judicial image is familiar from Babylonia, but in Assyria it becomes even more pronounced, perhaps because so much moral authority is concentrated in this one god. In the 9th century, the sun cult becomes especially prominent, and kings even call themselves the sun of the world, a phrase that feels foreign in tone and may reflect wider cultural contexts. Shamash is praised as guide, messenger, hero, judge of the world, and lord of law. Some kings build sanctuaries for him in distant regions to proclaim his reach. Yet even with this emphasis on justice, the warrior side of Shamash is not ignored. He is also invoked as a fighting power, fitting naturally into a culture that measures divine greatness through success in war. Ramman, the storm god, is closely linked with Shamash in Assyrian tradition, and this pairing is reflected in early royal names. The connection follows a natural logic. Storm and sun together represent overwhelming forces, both life-giving and destructive. Winning their favor would matter deeply to a warrior people. In Assyria, Ramman becomes far more popular than he was in the south, and his image often resembles Ashur's. Royal records describe him as a hero who floods enemy lands, shatters houses, and brings ruin through lightning, famine, and death. Kings compare their own military advance to a storm-driven assault of Ramman. During campaigns, they offer sacrifices to him, and when describing total destruction, they say they swept over everything like Ramman. In such language, he becomes one of the mightiest divine allies of the Assyrian state, and royal inscriptions even provide hints about the identity of his consort, showing that his cult also carried the typical pairing pattern of Mesopotamian religion. Sennacherib records that during his war in Babylonia, he removed the statues of Ramman and Shala from Babylon and returned them to Ekkalate, the city to which they originally belonged. He adds that this happened 418 years after an earlier Babylonian king had taken those same images from Ekkalate and carried them off to Babylon. Almost nothing else is known about Ekkalate beyond the fact that it lay somewhere in Assyria, probably in the southern part, and that Ramman and Shala were regarded there as the city's own protecting gods. The name Shala seems to mean something like woman, which makes it similar to other very general titles used for goddesses. Because of that, it is possible the same name was sometimes used for different female deities in different places. A figure called Shala of the Mountains appears in one catalog of divine names and is described there as the wife of Marduk. In another case, the wife of Bel is also called Shala, perhaps because later writers confused Bel and Marduk and shifted the name from one divine household to another. These catalogs should not be treated as firm evidence for actual worship in every case. They often reflect attempts to organize the divine world into tidy patterns, or they preserve the theories of certain priestly circles rather than everyday practice. In hymns, Shala is also mentioned as Ramman's partner, and a wordplay on her name turns her into a figure described as merciful. She is called the Lady of the Field, which sets her in contrast to Ramman instead of presenting her as an equal partner. Since references to her cult in Assyria are scarce beyond Sennacherib's note, it is likely that her status faded over time, as happened with many goddesses whose identities became little more than shadows beside the male god they accompanied. Another figure who gained royal favor because of his fierce and forceful character is the old Babylonian god commonly read as Ninib. The earliest Assyrian mention already calls him one of the mightiest divine powers, and rulers credit him with victories on every side. Tiglath-Pileser I praises him as a brave destroyer of enemies and a god who brings the king's wishes to fulfillment. His role as a war god stands out clearly in the way he is linked with Ashur. If Ashur is described as ruler over the spirits of heaven and earth, Ninib is described as their champion and heroic enforcer. Kings appeal to him in times of need. Among them, Ashur-Nasirpal seems especially devoted to Ninib. Instead of beginning his annals with a broad invocation to many gods, he opens with a long, direct praise of Ninib, piling up title after title that emphasizes military power. Ninib is portrayed as overwhelmingly strong, invincible in battle, crushing resistance, controlling the gates of heaven and earth, unleashing the deep, striking like a flood, and sweeping away enemy lands. The list is so long and intense that it feels almost like an attempt to overpower fear with words. Assyrian royal inscriptions often reuse earlier phrasing, and later kings echo what earlier scribes had written. That is why a later ruler, Shamshi-Ramman, offers a similar flood of titles for Ninib, clearly modeled on Ashur-Nasirpal's language. Even with this habit of copying, the pattern still suggests that during the century shaped by Ashur-Nasirpal and Shamshi-Ramman, Ninib's cult rose sharply in prominence, although it may have dipped for a time under a king whose main devotion leaned more toward Shamash. Ninib's main temple stood in Kala, the capital chosen by Ashur-Nasirpal, and the king celebrated it in a major inscription placed within the sanctuary. He also set up a colossal statue of the god, dedicated the building with sacrifices and prayers, fixed festival months for Ninib, and arranged for the cult's steady support. This does not mean Ashur-Nasirpal ignored other gods. He also repaired or built sanctuaries for deities such as Ishtar, Sin, Gula, Ea, and Ramman. What it does show is that kings often chose a special patron deity alongside Ashur, not because Ashur was neglected, but because Ashur's supremacy was so secure that no rival could threaten it. Ashur, represented above all by a portable war standard, did not rely on temples in the same way. Meanwhile, kings still wanted a personal divine protector to highlight in their own inscriptions. One chose Ramman, another Ninib, another Shamash, and later a different ruler would elevate Nabu. None of this was meant as disrespect to Ashur. It was a way of expressing devotion through a second focal figure. Ninib's help was not sought only in war. Assyrian kings loved violent sports, especially the hunt. Lions, wild horses, elephants, stags, boars, and bulls were pursued either in distant regions or within royal parks stocked for the chase. Ashur-Nasirpal traveled far into mountain lands for hunting and invoked Ninib together with Nergal, crediting them with placing the quarry into his hands. Tiglath-Pileser I, famous for lion and elephant hunts, boasts of extraordinary numbers of kills and links his success to Ninib's favor, together with Nergal and Ashur, who are said to have given him powerful weapons and the bow of victory. After the time of Shamshi-Ramman, Ninib appears mainly in the formal lists of gods placed at the start or end of later inscriptions. Those lists often repeat older models and help identify major deities, but they do not always show what cults were most alive in daily religious life. Ninib's relationships to other gods reveal how older ideas were preserved beneath later war imagery. earlier tradition connects him with Ninurta, or regional warrior and solar figures, and behind the battle titles lies a strong solar background. He originally embodied a phase of the sun, especially the rising and morning sun, which helps explain older epithets that describe him as light for heaven and earth, or as one who travels his path across the world. Other titles present him as born from earth imagery, reflecting the idea of the sun emerging from below the horizon. Over time, however, the climate and experience of Mesopotamia encouraged a darker interpretation of solar power. The sun can be gentle, but it can also burn, wither, and destroy. That destructive side fed naturally into a warlike image, especially in Assyria. Ninib becomes a storming force, a divine weapon whose assault shakes heaven and earth. The older solar identity survives only in fragments of mythic language, sometimes repeated more for grandeur than for clear understanding, while the public image becomes overwhelmingly that of a terrifying god of war. In Assyria, his consort is recognized as Gula, though she is invoked only occasionally. A sanctuary for her exists because she is tied to Ninib, and later notices mention a festival in her honor. Nergal also holds a place of honor. He is linked with Ninib in the hunt, and he is also invoked for war. He appears as another fierce battle power, marching before the king and carrying the weapons granted by Ashur. One inscription notes that when an Assyrian army reached the city, especially sacred to Nergal, Kutha, sacrifices were offered to him, and he was praised as a raging solar force and heroic divine champion. Later, kings honored him by naming distant fortresses after him, and there are signs that his cult enjoyed renewed attention in some periods. Sennacherib built a temple for Nergal at Tarbisu near Nineveh, and Ashurbanipal later worked on beautifying it, suggesting continued respect. Nergal's consort is named in tradition, but royal inscriptions largely ignore her. Sin, the moon god, plays a smaller role in Assyria than in Babylonia. A temple or chapel in Kala is linked to him, but it seems not to have become prominent. Sargon, interested in reviving older worship, built sanctuaries for Sin among many other gods, even beyond Assyria's core lands. Yet when Sin is mentioned, Assyrian ideology colors him with the same intimidating tone given to other gods in a warrior empire. He is described not only as linked to the crescent and to wisdom, but also as capable of striking fear. He is still connected with abundance and with decisions, yet his place remains secondary. An old title preserved in Assyria calls him the firstborn son of Bel, a phrase known from southern religious tradition. This points to the southern origin of much Assyrian moon worship, and hints that Assyria's lesser interest in astronomy and learned speculation may have helped keep Sin from rising higher in the northern hierarchy. Nusku appears clearly as a Babylonian deity in cult and literature, since he had a shrine in Marduk's great temple and is present in religious texts. It may seem surprising that he is largely absent from royal historical records until Assyrian times. One reason is that his identity was blurred through association with the fire god and through overlap with Nabu. Even the way his name was written in scribal practice pulled him toward Nabu, because the signs used could evoke both a staff of authority and a writing tool, matching ideas of rule and wisdom that also surround Nabu. Nusku is originally a solar figure and can easily be pulled toward fire symbolism, while other solar gods survived by developing traits that kept their identities distinct. In Assyria, beyond formal god lists, only a few kings mention Nusku with any detail. One calls him bearer of the shining scepter and speaks of him as wise, language that echoes Nabu. Another king emphasizes Nusku's role as the divine messenger, a figure who carries commands between the great gods, while also portraying him as a power who stands beside the king to help crush enemies under the orders of Ashur and the Great Lady. As Assyria tightened its grip over Babylonia from roughly the 12th century onward, Assyrian kings also became eager to claim the chief Babylonian god as part of their own religious world. By that time, Marduk had already absorbed the public role once held by the older Bel of Nippur, and in many texts, Marduk is simply called Bel. In this usage, Babylonia becomes the land of Bel, and Babylonians are described as the people of Bel, meaning the people under Marduk's patronage. The title used for an Assyrian official ruling in the south is described as the governor of Bel, and this remains a standard label for authority over Babylonia. The name Marduk itself appears less often in earlier Assyrian records because the title Bel was already doing the work. Even when kings give Bel ancient-sounding titles such as Father of the Gods or Ruler over the Spirits, the context often shows that Marduk is intended, especially when Bel is also called Lord of Lands, a phrase tied to Marduk's imperial identity. Control of Babylonia was a prize that Assyrian rulers valued deeply. The region was older, culturally prestigious, and filled with temples, festivals, learned priests, and enormous stores of sacred tradition. Assyria had gained much of its culture from the south, and the great southern sacred cities remained powerful as religious centers even when their political power weakened. That is why Assyrian kings liked to present their rule in the south as legitimate and divinely approved rather than as domination by force. They described themselves as chosen to govern the land of Bel. They wanted to appear as favorites and protectors of Marduk. When they marched into Babylonia to crush revolts, they often claimed they did so under Marduk's command, portraying themselves as defenders of his honor. In general, they treated Babylonia more gently than the distant regions they devastated in other campaigns. They often left internal administration in the hands of Babylonian rulers for long stretches, and only later, when repeated revolts made this difficult, did Assyrian kings begin appointing close royal relatives as viceroys. Assyrian rulers also took pains to respect and preserve Babylonian worship. They restored cults when they had been disrupted and publicly performed rites in major southern temples. After one campaign, a king entered Marduk's main sanctuary in Babylon and offered prayers and sacrifices, then went on to honor Nabu in nearby Borsippa with similar devotion. In war narratives, the names Ashur and Marduk are often paired, with victory credited to both. Over time, Marduk's name stopped being limited to Babylonian contexts and began appearing more generally in Assyrian royal language. Some kings openly framed themselves as saviors of Marduk's dignity, as if military action in the south were a sacred duty. Others declared that both Ashur and Marduk called them to the throne. Ashurbanipal went even further, personally taking part in ceremonies in Babylon when his brother was installed as viceroy, entering Marduk's temple, carrying out the expected rites, and ending with a serious prayer for continued blessing. His brother, when later attempting to break free, tried hard to win Marduk's favor because he knew the Babylonian population would follow the god's perceived will. References show that Marduk's festivals remained meaningful even far from Babylonia, and even in contexts where Assyrian kings sought oracles from Shamash, Marduk's name could be included alongside the sun god. At the same time, some passages in Assyrian inscriptions still use the title Bel in the older sense, referring not to Marduk, but to the ancient Bel of Nippur, showing that the overlap of titles could still create ambiguity. Tiglath-Pileser I says that he rebuilt a temple in the city of Ashur for a god called Bel, and he carefully adds the word old to the name. By doing that, he makes it clear that he is speaking about the ancient Bel linked with Nippur, not the Bel title that later became a common way of referring to Marduk. Another ruler, Sargon, who liked to revive and display older traditions, brings this same ancient Bel into a royal celebration at Khorsabad. He describes Bel with titles that fit only the older figure, calling him a great mountain and a lord of lands, and placing him in a setting imagined as a sacred mountain where the gods are born. Yet it is not always certain whether the king or his scribes truly kept a sharp boundary between the older Bel and Bel as a name for Marduk. Since Bel is placed immediately after Ashur in that list, it is possible that the scribes were aiming to invoke the chief god tied to Babylonia, and simply used older language while doing so. In other situations, however, the older Bel is clearly meant, especially when he appears alongside Anu, or when he is named as part of the well-known triad of Anu, Bel, and Ea. Sargon also names one of the gates of his palace after Bel and describes him as the power who lays the foundations of everything. Another clue that the older Bel is intended. The figure called Belit creates even more confusion in Assyrian sources. Sometimes Belit is presented as the wife of Bel, sometimes as the partner of Ashur, sometimes as the partner of Ea, and sometimes the word is used simply as another way to say Ishtar. This becomes easier to understand once it is remembered that Bel means lord and Belit means lady, and these words could function as titles as much as names. In Assyria, the title lady was often used for the foremost goddess, which could mean Ishtar, or it could mean a quieter goddess paired with Ashur as his consort. Over time, the Belit connected to Ashur seems to absorb traits that belonged properly to the wife of Marduk in Babylonian religion. A temple in Ashur that Tiglath-Pileser I enriches with trophies from conquered lands may originally have been linked with the Babylonian divine couple. But since the king treats Bel as a name for Marduk, he has little reason to focus devotion on Marduk's Babylonian wife. Instead, the older Belit is reshaped into a lofty spouse beloved of Ashur. Sargon, when naming a palace gate, uses a grand title meaning mistress of the gods, and this appears to point not to Ishtar, but to the consort of Ea, because elsewhere Ishtar and Belit are listed separately from that mistress title. Ashurbanipal continues the pattern of treating Belit as the wife of Ashur, and even describes himself as born from Ashur and Belit. At the same time, he gives Belit the title Mother of Great Gods, a title that properly belongs with the consort of the Babylonian Bel. In his full list of deities, Belit stands immediately behind Ashur. Ashurbanipal then adds a further layer of confusion by blending Belit with Ishtar. In a Nineveh context, the goddess in a particular temple is addressed interchangeably as Belit and as Ishtar, and elsewhere that same Belit is called the consort of Ashur. This shift likely reflects the way Ishtar's name increasingly became a general label for goddesshood in the later Assyrian period. Even so, not all earlier rulers follow that path. Shalmaneser II identifies the mother of the great gods more carefully with the wife of Bel. Another hint of uncertainty appears in a title meaning mistress of the land. which in at least one setting seems to refer to someone other than Ishtar. Yet even Ashurbanipal can still recognize an older Baalit linked with the Bel of Nippur, since he sometimes credits victory to a combination that includes Anu, Bel, and that older Baalit. Marduk's consort, known as Sarpanitum, is mentioned only in passing. One notice groups her with Marduk and with Nabu, and Nabu's consort as the chief divine powers of Babylonia, and another brief listing does something similar. Nabu's close bond with Marduk in Babylon naturally carries over into Assyria once the cult of Marduk becomes politically important in the north. Assyrian rulers often invoke Bel, meaning Marduk, together with Nabu when discussing Babylonian affairs, much as they invoke Ashur with Ishtar in Assyrian contexts. Some kings make Nabu a special favorite alongside Ashur. Under Raman-Nirari III, devotion to Nabu reaches an especially high point. He builds a temple for Nabu at Kala and pours out titles praising the god, ending a dedicatory text with a dramatic call for future generations to trust in Nabu above all others. That kind of wording should not be read as an attempt to abolish Ashur worship, since the same king still honors Ashur elsewhere, but it does show that Nabu held a strong personal pull for him after Ashur and Ishtar. The Babylonian identity of Nabu is clear from titles that connect him to Babylon and to his famous sanctuary at Borsippa, and the Assyrian temple for him even carries the same name as the one in the south. Nabu's appeal in Assyria is tied to his role as patron of wisdom, learning, and skilled culture. He can be praised without provoking rivalry because his sphere is knowledge rather than battlefield dominance. He is celebrated as guardian of the arts, the one who guides the writing tool of the scribe, and the holder of wisdom. Unlike war gods, he is usually described with qualities such as mercy, dignity, and majestic calm. Sargon calls him a clear-sighted guide for the gods, and when later writers call him a leader of forces, the image seems to point toward divine hosts rather than human armies. Kings with scholarly interests naturally advertise devotion to him. Sargon calls him the writer of everything, and Ashurbanipal repeatedly thanks Nabu and Nabu's consort for opening his ears to wisdom and supporting the building of a great library at Nineveh. Tashmitum, the consort of Nabu, shares honor in Nabu's Assyrian sanctuary, and she appears frequently alongside Nabu in Ashurbanipal's closing notes on tablets. Beyond that, she is mainly mentioned when Assyrian kings list the leading Babylonian gods during visits to the south for offerings. Ea holds an Assyrian place both as a wisdom figure and as part of the old triad. A sanctuary for him is noted at Ashur, and older mythic images survive in titles that call him a creator, ruler of the deep waters, or opener of springs. He is also portrayed as one who determines destinies. In building and craftsmanship, he appears as a master of skill who supports royal construction and monumental art. Because Ea and Nabu both stand for wisdom, their roles could overlap, but they remain distinct in emphasis. Nabu is centered on writing, learning, and scribal culture, while Ea is linked more strongly with creative making, architecture, and the crafting of great protective figures, divine images, temples, and palaces. Ea's consort appears occasionally. In Sargon's texts, she is called Mistress of the Gods, and the context shows that this title belongs to Ea's partner rather than to Ishtar or to Belit, since those names can appear beside it. Sargon even says his wisdom comes from Ea, and this mistress figure, and he links the same pair when naming palace gates. Among the lesser divine figures, Ningal is included among the sacred buildings in Sargon's royal residence. Another minor figure is the plague power often read as Dibhara, which sits close to the border between god and demon. Older stories treat him as a major actor, and traces of that tradition survive. But in royal writing, he can function simply as a personification of famine and ruin that follows war. In at least one description, victims of hunger and hardship are said to have filled city streets, and the destructive force is named as Dibhara. In later theological thinking, this figure is linked with Nergal. Sargon also mentions three names when describing restoration work in a distant place: Damku, meaning grace, Sharu Ilu, meaning king god, and a third female figure whose identity is uncertain. Damku and Sharu Ilu look like titles rather than true personal names, and it is unclear which gods were meant. They may have been local deities whose names were translated into Akkadian-style meanings. A similar pattern appears with a foreign god worshipped near the eastern frontier, showing that Assyria sometimes absorbed deities from neighboring regions. The third name is especially puzzling. Because it is called Mistress of Nineveh, it could be an unusual way of writing Ishtar rather than an imported goddess, but certainty is not possible. Finally, there is the broader issue of how these active gods relate to the long catalogues of divine names compiled by learned scribes in Babylonia and Assyria. These catalogues differ in purpose. Some gather the many names and titles that can belong to a single major god, showing how large gods absorbed the identities and functions of smaller ones. Other catalogues simply list local gods, and sometimes add place notes, which makes them more informative. Many such lists seem to have been built from names found in religious texts, since prayers and incantations frequently mention local cults and use titles instead of direct names. Yet the lists remain difficult to interpret. It is often unclear whether a name refers to a true god or to a spirit, and many titles and epithets have uncertain origins. Because of that, it would be risky to expand the pantheon simply by trusting the lists alone. Even though religious life tended to concentrate power in a smaller number of great gods, local cults likely continued in both Assyria and Babylonia, but present evidence does not allow a confident reconstruction of their full number or character. What can be done, however, is to show examples of minor figures that actually appear in historical, economic, or religious records. In the Assyrian setting, figures like Ningal, many divine consorts, and a handful of incidentally mentioned gods belong to this smaller circle. These examples are enough to underline a key distinction. Some gods were living focuses of worship and royal attention, while others held a more theoretical place, shaped by the learned system building of the age, reflecting political and social pressures as much as deep popular devotion. With that distinction in mind, later discoveries and new research can change details without overturning the basic structure. Assyrian rulers liked to open and close their inscriptions by naming a group of gods whose protection they claimed. They were following an older habit borrowed from Babylonia, but the purpose had changed. Earlier, Babylonian kings had often expanded their divine lists to display political reach, adding the gods of conquered towns as a sign that those places now lay under their authority. In the Assyrian age, that logic mattered far less. Independent city-states were no longer the main reality, and strictly local gods had lost much of their public weight. Over time, religious thinking in the South, shaped by learned tradition and popular custom together, had narrowed the focus to a smaller set of major gods with clearer roles. These leading figures were understood as covering the main powers that shaped human life. Some of them became especially favored in Assyria, while others remained more ceremonial names. Even so, later Assyrian kings often kept adding many deities into formal lists, including ones that were not central to everyday worship. Political calculation and simple imitation worked together, so the lists could feel more like a traditional formula than a personal confession of faith. These combined invocations usually appear at two key points. At the start, the gods are asked for support. At the end, the gods are called upon to punish anyone who might damage the king's monuments or erase his achievements. Sometimes the story of campaigns and building projects pauses in the middle as well, so the king can credit a set of gods for victory already won or for success still hoped for. Among these divine references, one older grouping holds a special place in theory: Anu, Bel, and Ea. In Babylonian practice, this trio is highly prominent, and Assyrian rulers also mention them at times, crediting them with victory, linking them with the calendar, and claiming they approved royal rule. Yet in Assyria, they rarely keep the same dominant position. One ruler in particular, Sargon, seems to have tried to revive interest in the older trio as a recognizable group, but the general pattern moves in the opposite direction. As the standard Assyrian lists develop from the time of Tiglath-Pileser onward, this trio often fades from view and can even vanish from the main formal enumerations, apart from occasional deliberate attempts to bring it back. Outside of that, the exact selection of gods can look partly accidental, though motives are often visible. When Assyrian kings marched into Babylonia for war or for offerings, they tended to name Babylonian gods alongside their own. Sometimes they limited the list to the most important southern figures, such as Marduk and Nabu. Sometimes they combined them with Ashur, or paired Ashur with Marduk to frame the campaign as supported by both empires' divine powers. At other times, the mix reflects the personal preferences of a particular king or the subject of the inscription. Tiglath-Pileser, for example, might close a text about a specific sanctuary by calling on only the gods connected to that place. In other contexts, he shifts the pairings, sometimes invoking Ashur with Shamash and Raman, or choosing a different combination without an obvious reason. Raman-Nirari I also varies, sometimes naming a broader set, sometimes a tighter group that still includes Ashur, Shamash, Raman, and Ishtar with Anu. As the centuries pass, the formal lists placed at the beginnings of inscriptions tend to grow longer. Ashurnasirpal presents several different groupings and often likes to name gods in pairs or small clusters, such as Ashur with Shamash, Ashur with Ninurta, Ashur with Bel, or Shamash with Raman. He can also reduce the list when describing the royal hunt, calling only on the gods most closely tied to that violent sport. Later rulers imitate this style, but each crafts different combinations. Shalmaneser II gives a large list including many major figures, presenting a broad official pantheon. Sargon varies his practice too, but one of his most revealing moments comes when he assigns divine names and functions to architectural features of his palace complex. In that setting, gods are attached to gates and walls with brief descriptions of what each one is believed to grant: victory, abundance, stable foundations, fertility, skilled work, flourishing communities, life-giving water, growth of families, protection of troops, and the strength of the city itself. The order in that list is shaped by the layout of the building rather than by strict rank. Later, kings continue the habit. Sennacherib sometimes uses a shorter list of leading gods, but in at least one context, he expands the roster dramatically, adding many lesser names to give the text extra solemnity. These added figures do not necessarily reflect active public worship. Esarhaddon uses several different combinations, usually circling around the same leading gods and the major forms of Ishtar. Ashurbanipal is the most consistent. He often uses short groups of 3 or 4 gods, but when he gives a full series, he tends to keep the same order and includes a fairly stable set of major names. Even though not every god in such a list was equally prominent in every generation, the formal inclusion of them shows that they still belonged to the recognized circle of great gods. That consistency matters because it suggests that even in the final period of Assyrian power, the royal court still felt the need to credit divine support in an official way for both past achievements and present authority. When Assyria fell and Babylonia regained independence in the late 7th century, the religious balance shifted sharply. Marduk's status rose in a way that was meant to be unmistakable. In Babylonia, he had always been acknowledged as the highest god, but under Assyrian control, he was treated as second to Ashur in official language. Assyrian kings spoke as if Babylonian gods were also their own allies, supporting Assyrian rule. When they invaded the south, they framed the campaign as divinely authorized, even describing it as the moment when Bel and the gods of Akkad travel from Assyria into Babylonia. For Babylonians, that kind of claim could only feel like an insult to their god's dignity. With the rise of Nabopolassar, the public language changes. Marduk is presented again as supreme, bearing the grand titles that Assyrian kings had loved to pile upon Ashur. Nabopolassar seems eager to underline the reversal by giving Marduk the full weight of cosmic kingship. Nebuchadnezzar continues the same policy even more forcefully, praising Marduk as ruler, creator, leader, and source of wisdom and mercy. Nabu also receives high honor in this period. Nabopolassar sometimes places Nabu on an almost equal level with Marduk, and even puts his name first. He appears careful not to describe Nabu as merely Marduk's subordinate, and the prominence of Nabu in royal names suggests genuine devotion. This emphasis may reflect lingering Assyrian influence, since Nabu was strongly promoted in Assyria as well. Yet Nabopolassar does not try to replace Marduk. Under Nebuchadnezzar, the older relationship returns more clearly, with Nabu honored chiefly as the divine messenger and helper of Marduk, still important, but no longer rivaling the head of the Pantheon. In the final years of the Babylonian monarchy, a different religious agenda seems to appear. Nabonidus gives extraordinary attention to the cult of Shamash and to restoring Shamash temples across the land, and this draws hostility from priestly groups who expected the highest priority to remain with Marduk. When Cyrus conquers Babylonia, he presents himself as the one who restores Marduk's honor, using religious language to justify political change. The Neo-Babylonian age can be described as a period of intense religious building and restoration. The rulers devote enormous energy to renewing old sanctuaries and expanding major temples, partly out of gratitude, partly to rival earlier imperial grandeur. In this, they differ from Assyrian kings, who are remembered above all for palaces and royal architecture. Neo-Babylonian inscriptions repeatedly highlight work on the great temples of Marduk in Babylon and Nabu in Borsippa, and kings proudly label themselves as beautifiers of these sacred centers. Within these major complexes were many subsidiary shrines for other gods, which also received royal attention. Beyond Babylon and Borsippa, the kings invest heavily in older sacred cities of the south, renewing temples for Shamash, Sin, and various forms of Ishtar and related goddesses. They also enrich Babylon and Borsippa with additional sanctuaries for a wide range of deities, and they support smaller shrines in other towns as well. Under Nebuchadnezzar especially, there is a strong revival of older cults, including some that seem very local and rarely appear elsewhere. Some divine names in his texts are hard to identify because of the way they are written, and a few may be local powers described through titles rather than personal names. Despite this broad revival, the basic ideas attached to the gods do not change much from earlier centuries. Shamash remains the judge, Sin the wise figure, Raman the storm power, and so on. The era is not one of fresh religious invention, but of renewed devotion expressed through rebuilding, traditional praise, and deliberate restoration of older practices. With Cyrus's conquest of Babylonia in 539, the old story enters its closing phase. Persian rulers maintain the main cults, and later Greek rule continues the policy of not immediately disrupting the religious order, but the long presence of foreign powers with different ways of thinking slowly undermines the old system. The writing tradition lasts for centuries, and worship continues, but the religion gradually loses vitality and sinks into more rigid and superstitious forms before finally disappearing. To understand the deeper spirit behind this religion, the most revealing evidence comes from the literature. In Babylonia, religious life and writing were tightly bound together from early times. Many major cities became centers of learning and composition, and almost every kind of text carried a sacred tone. Legal agreements were tied to oaths and divine witnesses. Court decisions were supported by appeals to the gods. Even dating systems often referred to festivals or temple events. The limited science of the time stayed connected to religious assumptions. Star watching was pursued as a way to read destiny, so astronomy remained closely tied to astrology. Medicine was also dominated by priestly practice. Illness was seen as the work of divine anger or harmful spirits, and healing combined remedies with spoken formulas and symbolic acts meant to drive away unseen forces. Historical writing, too, was saturated with religious meaning, since it was largely shaped by temple-trained scribes working in the service of kings who grounded their authority in divine favor. Because religion colored so much, the boundary between sacred and non-sacred writing is not always clear. Systems that look scientific can be driven by religious aims, and practical records can contain sacred language. Still, the main religious writings can be grouped into 5 broad types: magical and healing texts, hymns and prayers, omen collections and forecasts, writings about the origins and structure of the universe, and epics and legends. The first 3 are strongly practical in purpose, shaped by the needs of ritual, worship, and guidance. The last 2 are more purely literary, though they also serve religious identity. Texts used for rituals and healing were preserved because people believed they worked, and once written down, they could be taught consistently to new generations of temple staff. Different temples could develop their own versions, similar in core ideas but distinct enough to carry local character. Hymns and prayers were closely tied to particular gods and sanctuaries, and historical inscriptions sometimes record when and where such prayers were spoken. Omen texts were clearly useful to rulers and priests, since they offered a way to interpret unusual events and decide on action. Writings about the origin of the world reflect an older human impulse to explain mysteries, but they become organized only when learned circles shape popular ideas into coherent sequences. This development is slow and layered. Older elements born from popular imagination remain, while later layers show the shaping hand of schools that wanted to define accepted doctrine more clearly. In these compositions, reflections of history can also appear, because explaining origins could include stories about the beginnings of cities and civilized life, not only gods and nature. Epics and legends show the historical spirit even more strongly. Memories of heroes and great events survive, gradually blending with myths about nature. Learned writers then give these stories a lasting literary form, often motivated by preservation, enjoyment of composition, and the desire to provide material for education in temple schools. Even when learning was aimed at practical careers such as scribes, judges, ritual experts, and interpreters of signs, sustained study naturally produced a love of learning and a taste for literature. In all of this, the Southern tradition remains dominant. Assyria inherits these ideas and uses the same kinds of texts, but the overall character of the literary tradition is mainly Babylonian. Assyrian contributions appear most clearly in certain prayers, oracles, and omen reports tied directly to royal inscriptions, and perhaps in small adjustments made to older stories during periods of Assyrian power. Even so, the large library gathered by Ashurbanipal is best understood as a collection of material copied from the great temple archives of the south. Assyrian schools certainly existed in major northern cities to train scribes and priests, but they do not seem to have reached a level of intellectual independence from Babylonian models except in minor details. The same pattern can be seen beyond literature, in religious art and ritual practice, which carry a southern imprint, even when adapted for northern tastes and political aims. When Babylonian religious writings are examined from the angle of daily practice, the first large group that stands out is the material built around spoken formulas and step-by-step actions meant to control unseen forces. The surviving pieces are numerous enough to show that an enormous body of texts once existed, designed to protect people from spirits that were believed to interfere with human life at any time. These works can be described as incantations because their main goal was to push back harmful powers through fixed words, repeated phrases, and carefully timed ritual acts. Over time, these spoken formulas did not remain as isolated lines. They were gathered into organized sets, surrounded by instructions, prayers, and short reflections, and then arranged into long sequences that could stretch across many clay tablets. In this way, a single ritual tradition could become a large collection with a clear internal structure, even if it had been built up gradually across generations. It is often said that this kind of writing represents the oldest layer of Babylonian religious literature. That idea contains some truth, but it is too simple if taken without limits. The versions that survive show signs of later shaping. Older beliefs were preserved, but new ideas were added, and the material was arranged in ways that reflect a more developed age than the one in which the earliest fears and earliest formulas first appeared. In fact, these incantation collections are not automatically older than omen texts, and parts of them can be no earlier than other major compositions. Still, the ritual world behind them does preserve some of the most primitive popular ideas. The basic picture is simple and powerful. Illness, misfortune, fear, and sudden disaster were often explained as the work of invisible, hostile beings. Those ideas did not fade easily, so even when later editors reworked the material, the older core remained more clearly visible here than in many other religious writings. Many tablets were found damaged, so it is difficult to trace a single strict plan behind every collection. Yet the repeated appearance of long series suggests that the serial format was not only common, but strongly preferred. Instead of naming a set after the opening line, many of these series carried a direct title that described the theme. One large collection focused on protection against evil spirits in general. Another centered on disturbances that affected the head and mind, while still touching other troubles as well. Two famous series carried names linked to burning, because a central action involved the burning of images linked with sorcery, with spoken formulas recited alongside that symbolic destruction. Some of these collections were extensive, running through many tablets and thousands of lines, which justifies thinking of them not as scattered spells, but as full ritual programs intended for real use. The practical reason for building such collections is clear. A formula was believed to work only in a specific situation or in a limited range of related situations. That pushed priests to gather many different texts so they could respond to every emergency. The priests who specialized in driving out harmful forces would have strong reasons to assemble and expand these collections. Each major sanctuary could develop its own body of material, adding new cases, new procedures, and new instructions, and borrowing what seemed effective from other places. Over generations, the collection would grow steadily, shaped by experience and by the desire to preserve exact words that were believed to matter. In that sense, these texts reflect the slow building of ritual practice into a large and detailed tradition, created from the ground up by repeated use. Certain patterns inside the incantations hint at older centers of origin. The frequent prominence of Ea and references tied to Eridu suggest that some of the material ultimately grew out of traditions linked with the cult of that god. Other sections that highlight fire gods naturally fit the work of priests attached to shrines where those gods were central. Yet incantation practice existed everywhere, so no single sanctuary can claim exclusive ownership. What can be said is that when formulas from many places were gathered into a single set, the result was often complicated. Long lists of divine names could appear inside one text because collectors tried to include every possible helper. Over time, this habit produced mixed material placed side by side. Large sections clearly belong together, such as sequences of addresses to fire or repeated descriptions of a famous group of spirits, but transitions between themes can be abrupt. The guiding principle seems to have been simple: include as much as possible so that no threat would be left uncovered. For the working priest, the order mattered less than access. The relevant section could be selected for the case at hand, and the tablets themselves often marked divisions clearly, matching changes in topic and reinforcing the practical character of the collections. As for when these texts took their surviving form, there are broad limits rather than one exact date. The dominance of Marduk that appears within the edited rituals points to a period after the political unification associated with Hammurabi, because that shift left visible traces in religious language and divine hierarchy. At the same time, features of the language suggest that many collections had already reached a mature shape by around the early second millennium. Later copies could be produced centuries afterward without changing the substance, because temples continued to expand, priests continued to train, and new copies were constantly needed. Copying and limited editing never truly stopped, so the safest conclusion is that the material passed through several phases, with older cores preserved inside later arrangements. A striking feature of many incantation tablets is the double writing style in which each line appears first in an older, traditional form, and then in a more directly readable form. The older style survived because religious tradition clung to ancient ways of writing long after everyday usage had moved on. The second line functioned as a guide for understanding, not as a careful translation designed to replace the sacred wording. Minor mismatches between the two versions show that the goal was not perfect correspondence, but practical help in reading the conservative text. This also reveals that the material went through editorial handling, because it reflects a time when the older style was no longer easy for every priest to read without assistance. Over time, new sections were sometimes composed directly in the newer writing style, and then later rendered back into the older form to maintain the traditional appearance. Alongside this, many incantations show clear rhythmic and stanza-like structures. Some are built in regular blocks of lines, sometimes with a repeated closing response. When a long series appears entirely in the newer style and shows poetic structure, it strongly suggests that it was composed that way from the start, rather than being a late rewriting of an older form. In other cases, where a mixed format appears, the poetic sections often point to an original composition in the more direct style, with the older-looking lines added later for tradition's sake. The real value of these texts lies in what they reveal about belief. Suffering and danger were widely explained through spirits and demons. Some of these beings were imagined as acting on their own, while others were thought to serve higher divine powers. The incantation rituals describe what these beings were like, how they moved, what they caused, and what could be done to drive them away. The demon world was not a neat system with clear categories. Many names emphasized power and force, others pointed to nighttime activity, and many described what the beings did: seizing, capturing, ambushing, oppressing, overthrowing. Taken together, these labels produce a consistent picture. The spirits were believed to hide in remote and shadowed places, among ruins, in deserts, on mountains, in graves, and near unhealthy waters. Night was their favored hour. They were imagined slipping quietly into houses through cracks and openings, and once attached to a victim, they were believed to torment without mercy. Violent winds, feverish sickness rising from marshy ground, wasting diseases, and plagues could all be blamed on such beings. Even small daily misfortunes could be traced to them: sudden accidents, quarrels, headaches, bad luck, and disturbing words that seemed to carry a curse. Mental disturbance was also linked to them, including the stirring of passion, jealousy, hatred, or irrational fear. Animals, too, were thought vulnerable, as if invisible attackers could scatter birds, strike down livestock, and spread harm through stables and fields. Because these spirits were imagined as able to enter food and drink and fill any space, no place seemed fully safe. Some spirits were closely tied to specific ideas. Ghost-like beings were imagined hovering near graves and attacking people at night. Night spirits were linked to nocturnal fear and dream experiences. A female night figure appears in some traditions as a seductive presence that inflames desire without satisfaction, reflecting anxieties linked with sleep and imagination. Certain demons were sometimes described as targeting particular parts of the body, such as the neck, the hand, the chest, or the loins. Yet these distinctions rarely dominate the ritual texts. The names are often grouped together as if they were near synonyms, suggesting that the main goal was not to define a demon with precision, but to cover every threat through broad language. Demons were usually imagined as having some form because in that stage of thought, an invisible force still needed a kind of living shape. Terrifying animals were favored as symbols, snakes that vanish suddenly, scorpions difficult to avoid, and monstrous beings imagined around graves and unhealthy places. Dangerous landscapes like deserts, deep waters, and mountains were pictured as their natural homes. Some were carved or drawn in protective contexts, such as boundary markers, to strengthen curses against trespassers. In official art, evil spirits often appear as frightening hybrid creatures with animal heads and human-like bodies, mouths open as if to bite, weapons raised as if ready to strike. Large guardian figures placed at entrances and gateways belong to the same logic, frightening beings used as protection against other frightening beings. Even so, most texts focus less on appearance and more on hidden action. Since the spirits were believed to act invisibly, it was hard to identify which one caused a particular problem. That is why many rituals list several beings at once and treat them as a group, directing the spoken attack against them together. One especially famous idea is the group of 7 spirits described as destructive and merciless. They are portrayed as neither male nor female, without family ties, deaf to prayer, hostile to divine order, and eager to spread trouble along roads and in public places. They are compared to violent forces like whirlwinds and are presented as able to bring chaos even into the heavenly realm, with lunar eclipses explained as their work. The number 7 here should not be taken as a strict head count. It functions as a symbolic way of saying many, a full and threatening set. These spirits are described as present everywhere, and yet untraceable, slipping through doors and bolts like snakes, arriving and vanishing without leaving proof. The point is not geography but helplessness. Danger can appear anywhere, at any time. The boundary between spirits and gods can become thin. Some beings that later appear as demons may once have been local protective gods of small places. When those places lost importance, the names did not vanish but survived as lesser forces in stories and rituals. As religious focus narrowed onto major gods, the world of spirits multiplied. Major affairs were entrusted to the gods, while everyday troubles and sudden pains were blamed on hostile spirits. The gods were generally approached as powers that could be persuaded and calmed, while hostile spirits were treated as enemies to be expelled. Alongside invisible spirits, another fear took hold: the belief that certain humans could wield demonic power. Such people were imagined as able to harm others at will. The suspicion may have grown from how unusual bodies and unusual minds were perceived. Deformity, strange behavior, madness, or an unsettling gaze could lull to the belief that a person carried unnatural force. At the same time, unusual talent, cunning, or exceptional strength could also attract suspicion, as if extraordinary ability must come from a dark source. Both men and women could be feared this way, but women were more often singled out. Witches appear frequently, and in the texts they are closely linked with demons, sometimes almost merged with them. They are said to steal breath, corrupt food and drink, bind a victim's mouth, enter the body, and cause physical and mental torment. In this view, the witch is the visible channel through which the invisible demon acts. Over time, witches are imagined as even more dangerous than demons because they can command spirits while remaining beyond the spirit's control. Many methods are described. A harmful gaze from an evil eye is feared. A spoken harmful word, meaning a hostile formula, is treated as a weapon. Poisonous mixtures made from plants are imagined as another tool. Beyond these direct methods, the most dramatic methods rely on symbolic action, built on the assumption that what is done to a symbol will happen to the person it represents. Knots tied in a cord, each tied with words, are meant to bind, choke, silence, and cripple the victim. Even more common is the making of a small figure representing the victim, formed from soft materials and then burned, buried among the dead, sealed away, cast into pits or water, or hidden in places that carry symbolic meaning such as thresholds and gates. Each act is intended to force a matching fate upon the real person. Against these dangers, people used protective objects. Small figures of protective gods could be set at doorways. Amulets were carried. Short, sacred texts were posted in houses as barriers against entry. But once harm was believed to have taken hold, the main response was to seek help from specialists trained to fight invisible forces. These specialists were priests who served as mediators, turning to the gods for help while directly confronting demons and sorcery through ritual. In early times, this kind of work was likely one of the central tasks that drew people to temples. Later, as temple institutions became larger and more complex, priestly roles became specialized. Some priests handled sacrifices, some watched over oracles, some served night and day duties, and scribes formed their own group. Out of this differentiation emerged a class of expert exorcisers, predecessors of later Eastern magicians, believed to possess the knowledge and authority needed to break curses and drive out hostile forces. Their methods mirror the supposed methods of witches but reverse the direction. Against hostile formulas, stronger formulas are spoken. Against knots, untying rituals are performed, with each act paired with words that symbolize release. Sometimes the gradual peeling of layers, such as the skins of an onion, becomes an image of loosening bondage. Against the making of harmful figures, counterfigures of the sorcerer or witch are prepared and burned, with ceremonies meant to destroy the attacker's power. Because night was feared as the prime time of demonic activity, the key hours of evening, midnight, and dawn were often chosen for these rites, and prayers were directed toward the gods associated with the night watches. Some rituals begin by calling on the night itself and the divine powers believed to move within darkness, marking the moment as a boundary between danger and protection. The spoken material itself varies widely. Sometimes it is a direct request to a god or to the spirits of heaven and earth, clearly stating what is desired. Sometimes it opens with a long report of suffering, describing sleeplessness, pain, fear, loss of joy, or the feeling of being bound and choked by unseen knots. After this lament, the decisive words are spoken by the exorciser and then repeated by the afflicted person. In other cases, the incantation works through threats, declaring punishment against the demon or the witch unless the victim is released. In such scenes, the exorciser speaks with authority, announcing that the same binding and crushing acts will be turned back on the attacker. These threats are supported by symbolic actions performed on effigies made from dark substances, reinforcing the claim that the hostile power is being trapped and destroyed. Alongside words and symbols, remedies made from plants and herbs also appear. Drinks and washes are prepared and applied to the body, blending ritual with practical healing. This is where magic and medicine meet. The plant is chosen because experience suggested it helped, but its power is also tied to spoken formulas and sacred procedure. The result is a complete system of protection and treatment in which unseen forces, hostile humans, divine helpers, spoken words, symbolic acts, and physical remedies all work together in a single worldview. A constant element in these ritual texts is the appeal to the gods. It is almost never absent. Just as rulers once listed as many divine powers as possible in order to secure wide protection, ritual specialists strengthened their spoken formulas by calling upon the greatest gods together with many lesser ones. Over time, this habit became so standardized that instead of naming every deity, a text might simply state how many gods were being invoked at that moment, whether 6, 10, 15, or even 50. Which gods were meant is no longer always clear, but the most important figures of the divine hierarchy were certainly included. Often full lists follow. At the head usually stand Anu, Bel, and Ea, sometimes alone, sometimes with their consorts. After them come Sin, Shamash, and the storm god, followed by other major figures such as Ninib, Marduk, Nergal, Nusku, and Gibil. The principal goddesses are added as well, especially Ishtar, Gula, and Bau. Alongside these well-known gods, an enormous number of minor divine beings appear throughout the rituals. Some are familiar from other religious or historical contexts, while many appear only once and are scarcely distinguishable from spirits. In many cases, even their pronunciation is uncertain. Some of these beings were once local gods whose worship faded as their communities lost importance. Others turn out to be nothing more than descriptive titles applied to major gods. When a divine name clearly expresses a function, such as Judge, Merciful One, Hearer of Prayer, or Conqueror of Enemies, it is evident that an established god is meant, just as Greek gods were often addressed by their qualities rather than their personal names. For the remaining figures who may represent independent deities, knowing more than their names would add little to the overall picture. Their worship introduced no new ideas. Simply listing them would serve only to illustrate how many local cults once existed and then vanished, leaving behind little more than a name preserved by chance. It is also important that not only gods were invoked. Stars, rivers, temples, and even cities could be called upon, since anything with sacred associations might be drawn into the ritual. Distinct from these long group invocations are a small number of gods who appear individually at key moments and for specific reasons. These figures form the true core of the ritual tradition. Their involvement is essential to the success of the act. They are directly connected with the suffering that needs to be removed. When illness is involved, they function as healers. When disaster is linked to natural events such as eclipses, floods, or famine, the moon god, storm god, solar powers, or agricultural deities are addressed. Above all, the leading gods of each region, Marduk in Babylonia and Ashur in Assyria, receive special attention. Among all these figures, Ea stands out most clearly. His prominence comes first from his close connection with humanity, but also from his identity as a god of water, Water is one of the main instruments of purification in ritual practice, and this gives Ea an added symbolic role. As the divine source of healing, he is portrayed as knowing every hidden remedy for the harm caused by spirits and sorcerers. He is seen as the master of destiny for humankind, the supreme expert in expulsion rituals, and the ultimate authority under whose protection the ritual specialist acts. Not only humans, but even other gods turn to him in moments of crisis. When the moon is darkened and terror spreads across heaven and earth, other gods are powerless. Only through Ea is order restored. Yet Ea is rarely approached directly. His son Marduk stands beside him as mediator. Appeals are directed to Marduk, who then brings the plea to his father. Ea responds by explaining the remedy, while declaring that Marduk shares his knowledge. In this way, Marduk takes on the same titles as Ea and becomes a healer, protector, and master of ritual. This strong role for Marduk reflects a later stage, shaped by his rise to supreme status after political unification. Originally, Ea alone held this position. The occasional presence of Ea's consort contrasts with the relative absence of Marduk's partner, which again points to older layers beneath later revisions. Because the destruction of harmful forces often involved burning images or objects, the god of fire holds a place nearly equal to Ea. Fire, like water, carried deep symbolic meaning as a purifier. The fire god appears under two names, Gibel and Nusku, which are treated as interchangeable. Their merging likely reflects the way ritual traditions from different regions were brought together. In some areas, one name was preferred, in others, the second. Gibel seems to be the older figure, and the frequent appearance of his name suggests that some ritual material is very ancient. There was no reason to replace him, so later editing left his prominence intact. For practical purposes, the two are best treated as a single fire deity. This fire god is described as a son of Anu, the firstborn of heaven, reflecting the widespread belief that fire has a divine origin. He is portrayed as powerful, radiant, and terrifying, both a messenger of the gods and their advisor. His brilliance cannot be extinguished, and his authority is supreme. Because fire was central to human life, he is also credited as a founder of cities and a promoter of civilization. In ritual practice, he is invoked especially when images of witches or hostile forces are burned. The afflicted person often holds a torch while repeating the spoken words, sometimes in a whisper, echoing the soft voices attributed to spirits. Many of the texts devoted to the fire, God rise to the level of hymns, praising his splendor, strength, and indispensable role in worship. Fire is the medium through which offerings reach the gods. No sacrifice can proceed without it. Even the sun god, despite embodying light and heat, is shown as dependent on the fire god's function. The fire god is also linked with Bel and Ea. He serves as Bel's messenger and as Ea's son, combining authority and purification. This relationship unites water and fire, the two great cleansing elements under a shared structure. As a result, many of Ea's titles are also applied to the fire god. At the same time, the fire god remains closely tied to solar powers, which explains why Shamash and other solar figures often appear alongside him. Shamash, as the great judge, is especially appropriate in cases where justice is sought against demons or sorcerers. Because incantations were often recited at night, the moon god naturally takes part in many invocations. Although usually secondary, he is rarely omitted. In times of national crisis, especially during lunar eclipses, he becomes central. The disappearance of the moon was seen as a sign of divine anger or cosmic defeat, threatening war, disease, or unrest. In such moments, rulers themselves turned to ritual specialists. Ceremonies were carefully arranged, beginning with prayers to the moon god, praising his light and authority over fate. Offerings and libations followed, combined with further appeals to other major gods. Through these acts, the hope was to restore balance and avert disaster. Ea's role as water god also draws other water-related figures into the rituals. Rivers and purification spirits are invoked as embodiments of cleansing power. Certain goddesses appear as protectors who enter the sufferer's body to drive out harmful influences. Healers such as Gula are called upon alongside underworld figures who can restrain spirits linked with the dead. Even legendary heroes appear, reflecting their deep roots in myth and their association with solar and fiery power. Overall, the choice of divine helpers is largely shaped by the symbolic importance of water and fire, though not every name fits neatly into this pattern. The spoken formulas themselves consist of appeals mixed with words, whose power lies less in their meaning than in their utterance. The act of speaking is what matters. These formulas are arranged into ritual sequences, with clear instructions about when and how they are to be used. In one major ritual focused on burning, the afflicted person begins by calling on the gods of the night, describing suffering and asking for justice. Harmful influences are described as knots, poisons, or foul substances, and healing herbs are invoked as agents of cleansing. Purity is expressed not only in physical terms, but as brightness and renewal, a return to a state worthy of the gods. Some formulas are brief and direct, others long and elaborate. In certain sections, the sufferer symbolically imitates the actions of the sorcerer in order to reverse them. Imaginary cities, gates, and barriers are described, then ritually blocked or cut off. Through such actions, the source of harm is isolated and neutralized. The rituals often combine spoken commands with physical gestures, all aimed at breaking the power of unseen enemies. When images of sorcerers or demons are burned, the fire god is invoked with strong language, commanding that the harm inflicted be turned back upon its source. The same logic applies to demons, who are ordered to melt away, scatter, and vanish as smoke. In cases where the attacker is unknown, formulas directly address the hidden enemy, binding limbs, silencing speech, and calling on divine power to cast the threat away. Repetition plays a crucial role. Phrases are repeated again and again, slightly varied, building force through rhythm. One tablet even summarizes all previous sections by repeating their opening lines before presenting a final incantation, gathering all earlier power into one act. Other ritual series place stronger emphasis on Aya and Marduk. In these, suffering is described as the result of a curse that drives away personal divine protection. Marduk brings the case before Aya, who prescribes purification and release. Water is used repeatedly, described as pure, radiant, and sacred, washing away evil while protective spirits take the sufferer's place. Additional methods include binding wool threads to a bed, symbolically blocking the approach of hostile forces. Despite their roots in fear and magic, these texts also introduce moral ideas. Harm may be linked to wrongdoing. Long lists of possible offenses are recited, ranging from injustice and dishonesty to family conflict and ritual mistakes. The purpose is not confession in a moral sense, but completeness. By naming every possible cause, the ritual aims to strike the true source of suffering. Once named, it loses power. Success depends on speaking the right words, naming the right powers, performing the correct actions, and offering the proper gifts. At this point, incantations begin to merge with prayers. Many texts are, in essence, prayers supported by ritual language. Even when formulas are believed to carry inherent power, the final outcome depends on divine favor. This blending reflects the adaptation of older practices to later religious sensibilities, giving the gods a more central role without abandoning belief in spoken power. Through this process, ritual formulas gradually lead into full prayers and hymns, forming the next major branch of Babylonian religious tradition. What has been described so far makes one thing clear. Moving from spoken spells to full prayers and hymns was an easy shift. It did not automatically mean that people suddenly held deeper or more advanced beliefs. The oldest fixed ritual tradition in Babylonian and Assyrian religion is closely tied to incantations. Yet, even in the earliest periods, there were times when the gods were addressed in plain prayer without any magical wording. This happened during major festivals, when temples or sacred images were dedicated, and even when public works were completed, such as digging canals. When a ruler finished a statue for a patron god, he could simply ask for a good destiny in return. Later, kings did the same whenever they restored or built temples. Some of the finest examples come from Nebuchadnezzar, whose prayers show careful language and strong emotion. After restoring a healing goddess's shrine at Sippar, he asks her to look kindly on his work, to speak mercy, and to grant long life, strength, health, and joy, while also asking that the great gods view his deeds favorably. When restoring the famous Temple of the Sun, god at Sippar, he prays for mercy, power, a stable throne, lasting rule, protection for his army, and clear answers through signs and dreams. Nebuchadnezzar's building records often end this way. Whether he raised a sanctuary, strengthened city defenses, or built waterways, he added a closing appeal for grace, long life, and prosperity. Other rulers did the same. Some built temples as an act of gratitude, claiming that a god had listened to earlier prayers. Assyrian kings prayed before battle and thanked the gods after victory. A king might present himself as a creation of a goddess, insist that he had devoted himself to restoring sanctuaries and expanding cities, and then beg the divine warrior to drive an enemy into chaos and defeat. Elsewhere, rulers approached the chief god of the empire and asked for a chosen name to flourish, for guidance on the right path, and for a heart filled with reverence rather than pride. Kings often described rule not as a personal right, but as a trust placed in their hands, and they asked to be shaped into just leaders whose authority would serve the people. Even the curses that close many royal inscriptions can be understood as prayers in another form, because they call on divine power to punish wrongdoing. Sacrifice, which always stood at the center of worship, would also have been accompanied by spoken appeals, whether to a single god or to many. For all these reasons, it is impossible to draw a strict line separating incantations from hymns and prayers. The same gods appear across the different kinds of texts, and they are imagined in much the same way. Ea remains the protector of humanity. Shamash remains the guardian of justice. If a quality that appears strongly in prayers is less visible in certain incantations, that difference may reflect chance and emphasis rather than a separate set of beliefs. The divine hierarchy also matches what appears in royal inscriptions, and the order in which gods are named often follows the ranking found in official tradition. This strongly suggests that many older ritual texts were later reshaped and updated. It is true that incantations preserve more traces of early mythic thinking than many hymns and prayers, but mythic imagery never disappears completely. Even the most refined religious works of Babylonia still carry very ancient ways of thinking beneath the surface. The best way to understand hymns and prayers, then, is to see them as companions to the magical texts. They grow from the same belief in divine power, express the same religious mood, and were produced in the same cultural world where ritual incantations still mattered deeply. They did not replace older practices. They existed beside them. At the same time, some hymns clearly rise above others. Once the act of addressing the gods could be separated from strictly practical ritual procedures, the conditions for higher religious thought became stronger. A song of praise for a victory or gratitude for a favor could bring out a person's best feelings. In such moments, the deity was viewed not only as strong, but as caring, protective, fair, and attentive. The tone became more human. The worshipper's affection came forward, and the god was described in ways that reflected ideals the worshipper wished to see in the world. This is why hymns and prayers are so important for understanding the ethical direction of Babylonian religion, because the highest moral and spiritual language appears most clearly there. Nebuchadnezzar's prayers are often the strongest examples. When he addresses the supreme God at the moment of taking the throne, he speaks with humility and responsibility. Kingship is treated as a gift, not a personal claim. The ruler presents himself as formed by divine hands and asks for guidance toward righteousness. Wealth and domination are not praised as goals. What matters is reverence and right conduct, because life itself is believed to be held in divine control. That tone is rarely reached in incantation texts, yet even the best hymns still show their roots. Some end with short ritual lines. Others, though independent, still mention illness, spirits, sorcery, or unseen dangers, showing how closely hymn tradition grew out of older ritual speech. The key difference is that hymns push the same basic religious ideas further. They represent an effort to move away from a purely superstitious view of life and divine power, an effort that never fully succeeds, but still produces striking works. Many hymns from the Assyrian royal library survive only in fragments. Because the closing notes are often missing, the exact occasion for which a hymn was composed is frequently unknown, making dating difficult unless the content offers clues. Still, it is likely that large temple centers built collections organized around major gods. There are signs of sets devoted to the sun god, including pieces meant for sunrise and others for sunset, likely shaped for use in a great sanctuary such as the temple at Sippar. Other gods also had hymn traditions, especially those worshipped in the largest temples, while many hymns seem to have been composed for single events and never fitted into a long ritual sequence. Among the published hymns, those to Shamash are often the most powerful. Because the sun god was seen as judge of humanity, these hymns naturally focus on justice and righteousness. Shamash is praised as the guide of human order, the one who knows right and wrong, the supreme judge of heaven and earth, and the merciful Lord of the world. Yet the purpose of such hymns often turns out to be practical as well. After praising the god, the hymn can become a request for the king's life and purification, asking that anything evil within him be removed. Sometimes the language slips into ritual phrasing, asking that the king be cleansed and brightened, and that a ban be lifted. This kind of shift shows how easily elevated prayer could slide back into older ritual patterns. In fact, several Shamash hymns appear to form parts of larger sequences, suggesting a developed tradition of sunrise and sunset worship, where hymn and ritual speech were combined. Sunrise hymns describe the sun emerging from the horizon, opening the gates of heaven and covering the world with radiance. Sunset hymns guide the god's course toward his sanctuary, asking that divine companions greet him, that his heart be at peace, and that his path be set. Even when the language is lofty, some of these texts still function inside ritual frameworks, much like the beautiful praises once addressed to the fire god in burning rituals. Hymns to the moon, God can reach a different kind of height. A long hymn to Sin pours out praise with intense poetic force, calling him chief among the gods, protector of sanctuaries, giver of life, and ruler whose command cannot be challenged. Ancient images remain, such as the moon as a bull of great strength, or as an aged figure with a flowing beard of deep blue brilliance. Yet these images are used to express spiritual themes rather than crude myth alone. The moon's influence on seasons and growth becomes a reason to praise him as generous and merciful. The moon is portrayed as a benefactor who restores strength after the heat of day, a divine presence before whom both gods and spirits bow. This hymn contains no clear reference to driving away demons or breaking sorcery. It stands as a pure act of praise shaped for temple worship, likely connected to the moon's great sanctuary at Ur. The structure of some hymns also reveals how they were performed. In certain works, lines are arranged for alternating voices, suggesting a reciting priest and a responding chorus. Question and answer, or call and response, appears as a natural development from older practices where a ritual specialist spoke first and the sufferer repeated the words after him. Over time, this pattern could evolve into full public recitation and sung worship. Not every god could be developed in an ethical direction. Shamash and Sin naturally encouraged such themes, and the god of wisdom also invited spiritual praise. Hymns to Ea are not clearly preserved, perhaps by chance, or perhaps because Ea's role remained tied so strongly to ritual healing and protection that a separate hymn tradition did not grow as clearly outside that setting. A hymn to the god of wisdom, though only partly preserved, shows how spiritual language could be used even within a polytheistic world, praising unmatched power and unchangeable command, while still carrying older mythic references beneath the surface. Marduk occupies a middle ground. Because of his connection to Ea and his position as Babylon's supreme god, hymns to him sometimes end with ritual lines, while others function as formal temple praise during major ceremonies. The level of thought in both types can be equally refined. One hymn praises him as merciful and life-giving, ruler of heaven and earth, master of the life-giving word, and protector of all living beings and divine assemblies. It is arranged for two voices, giving it a solemn liturgical rhythm. Yet the same hymn tradition can suddenly turn practical near the end, asking him to expel disease and drive out hostile spirits. This mixture shows how close hymn and incantation remained, even when the language was elevated. A different kind of Marduk hymn focuses on calming divine anger. The city and temple are described as speaking peace to the god, urging him to rest. Rest here means that anger has ceased. The great gods themselves are portrayed as joining the appeal, because the entire world depends on the deity's calm. Such a hymn reflects a moment when misfortune has struck, and everyone seeks reconciliation with the offended divine ruler. Similar hymns exist for other gods as well. A hymn to the storm god portrays him as terrifying, shaking earth and heaven, driving gods to flee and throwing the cosmos into disorder, a clear sign of fear mixed with awe. Another striking feature appears in hymns, where the god speaks within the text. A hymn to Ishtar as morning and evening star begins with praise, describing her as a blazing light, a restless hunter, a fierce lion, a force that brings life yet can also destroy. Then the goddess answers through the officiant, declaring that she is established for the giving of oracles, tied to the authority of the moon and sun gods. The repeated refrain suggests choral participation. The goddess continues, proclaiming her supremacy, her power to open heaven's lock, to devastate earth and heaven, to sweep away mountains, and to rule both above and below. Despite this fierce self-portrayal, the hymn ends with an appeal for calm, urging her heart to be at rest and her anger to be pacified, repeated through a long list of her titles and sacred places. This ending captures a central tone of Babylonian worship. Love and admiration are always mixed with uncertainty, because divine favor can never be taken for granted. In the hymns addressed to Ishtar and Marduk, special emphasis is placed on calming the anger of the gods. From very early times, misfortune was understood as a sign of divine displeasure, and this idea never disappeared from Babylonian religious thought. Wrongdoing could only be resolved by restoring harmony with the offended deity. Over time, however, this belief developed an ethical depth that is striking for its seriousness and clarity. Rather than relying only on ritual formulas, those struck by illness or hardship turned to prayer, appealing directly to the god whose anger was believed to lie behind their suffering and seeking reconciliation. Although these penitential prayers grew out of the same mindset that produced magical rituals, they gradually became distinct from them. Magical texts continued to exist, and at times were combined with more elevated prayers, yet the difference between the two became increasingly clear. Some scholars have suggested that large-scale disasters, rather than personal misfortune, may have encouraged the development of these penitential prayers. This view is supported by the fact that certain hymns include references to historical events and sometimes contain prayers on behalf of kings and entire cities. During times of crisis, rulers were instructed to recite laments meant to calm the divine heart, showing that these prayers had a public and political role as well as a personal one. Military defeat, famine, or devastation was naturally explained as divine anger rather than the work of demons or sorcery. While the deeply personal tone of many penitential prayers allowed them to be used by individuals, their suitability for national emergencies helped separate them from purely magical traditions. Reflection on divine anger encouraged a more serious understanding of the bond between humans and gods. More than in hymns of praise, these prayers emphasize devotion and emotional closeness. Even when love for the god is not directly stated, it is clearly implied as the counterpart to divine wrath. These prayers reveal Babylonian religious thought at its highest level. Their ethical character appears most clearly in how they define sin. Misfortune created a strong sense of guilt. Suffering itself was proof that some offense had been committed, even if the nature of that offense remained unknown. There was no attempt to judge whether the punishment was fair or proportional. What mattered was that a god had been offended, whether through neglect, ritual error, or an unknown fault. The central concern was to appease divine anger. Within this framework, the idea emerged that suffering resulted from wrongdoing. A person recognized guilt only through the experience of hardship. Illness, loss, disaster, defeat, or personal grief served as reminders that divine favor had been lost. These prayers never abandon the traditional idea of sin as failure to meet divine expectations, whether intentional or not. Yet within these limits, they allowed for remarkable ethical reflection. Some of these prayers express a depth of feeling and moral seriousness that has often been compared to later religious traditions. The one who prayed felt completely dependent on divine mercy. The exact nature of the sin was less important than the urgency of reconciliation. This led to intense expressions of humility and remorse, often exaggerated in language, but sincere in intent. The worshipper magnified the power and compassion of the deity while diminishing personal worth. Such emotional discipline naturally encouraged a more spiritual understanding of divine relationships. The prayer focused not on material gain, but on restoring peace between God and worshipper. The single desire was that the divine heart might be brought to rest. For these reasons, penitential prayers represent the finest achievement of Babylonian religious literature. They mark the highest point of ethical reflection reached in the culture of the Euphrates Valley and remain the most enduring literary expressions produced in cuneiform tradition. Another important feature of these prayers is their dialogue structure. Reconciliation required three figures: the deity, the sinner, and the priest. Direct access to the god was believed impossible. Communication had to pass through divine intermediaries and human representatives. The priest acted as the earthly messenger of the god, sometimes even speaking in the voice of the deity. More often, the priest served as advocate, reinforcing the sincerity of the confession and urging the god to show mercy. Unfortunately, none of these prayers survive in perfect condition. Many lines are damaged or unclear, and key details are missing. Even so, their meaning remains powerful. Most were preserved in dual written forms, but this appears to be a matter of tradition rather than meaning. Some contain hints of historical events, which suggests they may date back to very early periods, possibly as far as 2,000 years before the Common Era. Yet stylistic features suggest that many belong to later centuries. The Assyrians adopted these prayers and added new compositions of their own, closely following Babylonian models. One particularly moving prayer shows a sufferer calling upon a goddess for mercy, describing constant sorrow and pleading for compassion. The priest then supports the appeal, asking the goddess to turn her face toward the afflicted person and take them by the hand. The sufferer continues by expressing loneliness and despair, weeping like a dove and filling the night with sighs. The priest again reinforces the plea, describing the depth of the suffering soul. A striking aspect of many penitential prayers is that the offended deity is often unnamed. The god or goddess is referred to in general terms, or both are mentioned together. This reflects uncertainty about which divine power has been offended. Suffering revealed guilt, but not its source. This anonymity gradually encouraged a more abstract understanding of divine power. Rather than focusing on individual gods, these prayers emphasize dependence on divine forces as a whole. Even so, this development never leads to true monotheism. The strong influence of astrology and nature worship prevented such a shift. The penitential prayers refine existing beliefs, but do not replace them. Some prayers openly admit uncertainty, appealing to any god or goddess who may have been offended, known or unknown. The sufferer confesses ignorance of the sin, yet accepts guilt, and undertakes fasting as an act of penance. This physical discipline appears frequently and was likely part of ritual practice. The prayers describe abandonment, isolation, and despair, followed by repeated appeals for forgiveness. The priest eventually intervenes, asking the god not to reject the weeping servant. The prayer closes with an intense plea for mercy, forgiveness, and emotional reconciliation, often expressed through tender imagery of parental love. Variations in structure suggest that different temples preserved different ritual forms, which were later collected into larger traditions. Some prayers clearly belong to royal contexts. They mention cities, temples, dreams, and divine signs sought before military campaigns. Kings sought assurance of forgiveness and favor before major crises. These prayers reveal moments of fear and uncertainty that official records carefully avoided. Others combine requests for forgiveness with appeals for healing. Since illness was seen as divine punishment, relief from sickness depended on restoring divine favor. One Assyrian king appeals to Ishtar, reminding her of temples restored, festivals honored, and images erected. In return, he asks for mercy, healing, and forgiveness. These historical references provide valuable insight into the use of penitential prayers. They reveal times of crisis hidden from official accounts. Unlike magical texts rooted in popular belief, these prayers appear to have held official status, closely connected to state concerns. Their development reflects the growing importance of the relationship between gods and the fate of the kingdom. Despite their elevated language and moral depth, these prayers remain closely linked to another branch of religious tradition: omens and oracles. Like penitential prayers, omens addressed matters of state and divine approval. In this shared concern for divine will and political stability, the religious traditions of Babylonia and Assyria remained deeply intertwined. A strong strain of magic remained inside Babylonian prayers and hymns, even when the language sounded noble and heartfelt. The finest prayers were often joined to a spell-like formula, and sometimes the prayer itself functioned as a kind of incantation. Prayer rarely stood alone. It was usually paired with offerings, symbolic actions, or both. People believed the power of the request came partly from these acts and partly from the hidden force carried by the words themselves. This close bond between prayer and magic grew from a simple habit. Gods were usually approached only when something was needed. People prayed to push away danger or to gain a favor. Even the most elevated penitential prayers were not simply expressions of admiration. They were spoken because trouble had arrived or seemed close. Pure praise, offered without any purpose beyond devotion, barely appears in Babylonian and Assyrian religious practice. The nearest thing to that spirit may be found in the prayers kings added to commemorations of their building projects. Those royal prayers sometimes feel driven by genuine affection and loyalty to a protecting god. Nebuchadnezzar stands out as a strong example, yet even there a request is nearly always included, usually for long life and prosperity. In this way, spiritual development faced clear limits. A form of prayer that exists only to seek closeness with a higher power without asking for anything at all would require a very different understanding of the gods. That kind of prayer is largely absent. Because Babylonian prayer was normally a request, it naturally led to another urgent concern: finding out what the gods intended to do in response. Learning the divine decision became a central part of ritual life, and it was largely the priest's responsibility. A prayer meant little unless it received an answer, and only the priest could declare whether an answer had been given. Much of the priest's work therefore focused on forecasting. Would deliverance actually come? Would sickness leave the body? Would symbolic acts like burning an effigy or loosening a knot truly work? The reputation of the priest and the hopes of the person seeking help depended on the ability to read the future. This is why the priest who drives away harmful forces is closely linked to the priest who predicts outcomes. Since direct access to a deity was not expected, mediation was needed for religious matters of every kind, including those involving kings. The priest had two main ways to discover divine intent. One was through oracles, understood as direct messages. The other was through omens, read indirectly by examining the sacrificed animal. A complete ritual could therefore include a request offered with priestly help, an incantation in some form, an offering, symbolic actions, and finally a set of signs that revealed the divine response. In many cases, the offering and symbolic acts came first, and prayers referred back to them later, often just before the signs were read. The signs were the goal. Offerings were brought, actions performed, and words recited to prepare for the final moment when the priest announced what the signs meant. Worshippers waited for that decision with anxiety. Because of this, many prayers include instructions aimed at priests, pointing to details they should watch for in the sacrificed animal. Over time, the reading of these signs expanded into a vast system comparable in scope to the observation of the heavens. The movement of stars and planets, and the patterns of nature as a whole, were believed to shape human fate. And the same mindset encouraged careful attention to signs found in sacrifice. Not every prayer required such elaborate procedures. Some surviving prayers contain no explicit mention of offerings, symbolic actions, or signs. This does not prove they were absent in practice, since texts could be copied with parts omitted. Still, it is likely that in many situations, sacred formulas alone were considered sufficient, especially when the goal was to drive out hostile forces. In earlier stages, the priest may have ended the ritual once the words had been spoken. If the harmful power did not yield, the failure could be blamed on a mistake by the priest, suggesting a loss of control due to error or impurity. The wider use of omens likely began when a person wanted more than relief and needed guidance, wanting to know a deity's decision so that future actions could be planned accordingly. Once that practice grew, the reading of signs became common across many situations, whether an incantation was included or not. In both cases, the aim was the same: to learn whether the request would be granted, or to discover what it was important to know. People consulted deities for private and public reasons. Evidence exists of individuals asking which day was favorable for a project and receiving a specific answer. Yet for most people, visiting a sanctuary may have been reserved for serious moments: illness, sudden loss, fear of misfortune, or the need to calm an offended god. Cost also mattered. No one was expected to arrive without gifts, and that expense discouraged frequent visits. Public needs played an even greater role. State safety demanded constant consultation. That is why so many hymns and prayers mention kings and events tied to their reigns. The anger of a god against the land is emphasized more often than anger against a single person, because the fate of the state shaped the lives of everyone within it. Natural shocks like eclipses, floods, and storms were seen as blows directed at the country under a god's domain, not simply at individuals. Crop failure, famine, and plague were also public disasters. During such times, rulers went to sanctuaries to seek peace with the divine power, and it was not enough to speak words or perform actions. They wanted assurance that reconciliation was taking place, and they sought that assurance through signs read from sacrificed animals. The same need for guidance appeared whenever major public projects were planned. Building a palace, temple, canal, or dam required confidence that the work was acceptable. Leaders sought the right day to begin, when the god would be favorable, and the right day to dedicate the finished project. These decisions were also shaped by signs. The belief was simple. Without divine support, human effort could collapse. In war, this dependence grew even stronger. The gods were consulted repeatedly about enemy plans, approaching danger, the day of battle, the struggle itself, and the aftermath. Over time, official consultation developed a fixed style. From the reigns of Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal, there survives a set of structured prayers to the sun god that revolve around political questions. They follow a consistent pattern. The prayer begins with a series of questions and demands a clear response. It includes pleas that the god not be angered by any mistakes made during the ritual. The questions are then repeated in slightly different wording to ensure precision. After that, lists of possible signs are provided as guidance for reading the sacrificed animal. A decision is then reached based on what is observed. In one example, a king under threat from hostile peoples seeks to know whether a particular city will fall within a defined period. The request is extremely detailed, listing every possible way an enemy might succeed. Nothing is left vague. This careful wording reflects fear that an answer might be technically true, yet misleading if loopholes remained. Great attention was also given to the preparation of the sacrifice. The animal had to be flawless, the ritual space undefiled, the priest properly dressed and purified, and the spoken words correct. Prayers sometimes include a repeated request that various problems be prevented from occurring, such as contamination, mistakes, or weather that might obstruct the rite. Only after these safeguards does the priest proceed to inspect the animal. The text may list many points to watch for, such as irregularities in specific parts of the body, unusual shapes, or differences in proportion. These notes functioned like a checklist for trained specialists. Often the texts do not explain what each sign meant, likely because experienced priests already knew the interpretations through tradition and training. The ceremony ends with an appeal that the sacrifice be accepted and that a favorable message be granted. Such consultation could be extremely elaborate, especially for royal matters. Kings asked repeatedly about campaigns, alliances, envoys, succession plans, and even family affairs. Before sending an official abroad, a king might ask whether the messenger would remain loyal. Before arranging a political marriage, the king might ask whether the foreign ruler could be trusted. Before bringing a son into shared rule, the king might ask whether it would cause conflict. When illness struck the royal household, a question might be asked about recovery. Sometimes the question was written on a tablet and placed before the deity, suggesting that written communication could form part of the ritual process. Not every inquiry demanded a full ceremony. Sometimes kings sent simple questions and received direct replies from specialists. Reports about the moon and stars also guided decisions, and favorable or unfavorable days could be named. There were even standard oracle templates with blank spaces, meant to be filled in with names for common situations, such as appointments to office. Given the violence of palace politics and frequent coups, it is understandable that rulers sought constant reassurance. While older Babylonian oracle texts are scarce, there is strong reason to believe that similar practices existed earlier and were refined later, especially in the Assyrian world, where war and diplomacy created endless reasons to seek divine guidance. Over time, priestly roles likely became more specialized. Those who performed expulsions could differ from those who read signs, and those who delivered oracles could form another group. Marduk was widely viewed as a major source of oracles, which suggests this specialized function was recognized in the south before being embraced in the north. In the Assyrian period, oracles were often spoken in the first person, as though the deity were speaking directly. Many political oracles came from Ishtar of Arbela and were delivered by temple personnel, frequently women. Several surviving messages emphasize courage, repeat commanding phrases, and promise that enemies will be crushed. Their language is powerful and uplifting, but their meaning is often broad rather than specific. They were designed to strengthen resolve as much as to predict outcomes. Other oracles combined the voices of multiple gods, surrounding the king with divine protectors and urging him not to rely on humans, but to trust the divine presence. Assyrian rulers promoted a set of key deities in these practices, including Ishtar, Shamash, Nabu, and Ashur. Marduk, though respected, was less prominent in Assyria, likely because he represented the religious authority of Babylonia, which Assyria threatened politically. When an oracle was delivered, it could become a major ceremonial event. Just as questions were carefully written to avoid error, answers were also transmitted in writing. Some messages were formally read in the king's presence with libations, sacrifices, and incense. Oracles could also create tension. If a message proved unhelpful or unclear, rulers could complain, and new messages might be sent urging the king to trust the latest word. Kings often expected oracles to confirm what they wanted to hear. When events went badly, blame could shift to ritual mistakes or impurity, suggesting the divine message had been distorted. Priests, speaking for the gods, could also accuse kings of neglecting temple duties. A ruler might respond with larger offerings to restore favor. These oracles connect closely with penitential prayers. In political crisis, kings became more intense in devotion. When disaster loomed, it was easy to conclude that the gods were angered, and the safest response was confession, offerings, and ritual acts. Official inscriptions rarely admit setbacks, but penitential prayers reveal anxiety and humiliation during dangerous moments. One text shows a king confessing sins to Nabu and receiving reassurance and promises of survival and lasting authority. Such a message had practical meaning, especially when control of Babylonia was at risk and rebellion threatened the throne. Oracles also appeared through dreams. Divine messages could come in night visions that encouraged armies, commanded bold action, or promised protection. A goddess might appear in battle gear, standing before the king like a guardian, speaking words of confidence. A god might even appear to a foreign ruler, instructing him to honor the Assyrian king. Sometimes a divine warning was believed to appear as writing on the moon's face, threatening death to those who plotted against the ruler. Dreams could function both as direct messages and as signs requiring interpretation. When a dream arrived, people could ask that it be turned into a favorable meaning. In this way, the boundary between oracle and omen became thin. Both were understood as channels through which the divine will was revealed, whether clearly spoken or symbolically hinted. From here, the wider system of signs and predictions expands far beyond sacrifice alone and becomes a central feature of religious life. The different branches of Babylonian and Assyrian religious writing were closely connected to one another. Magical incantations were essentially a form of prayer, and prayers themselves were never fully separated from magic. Whether a text took the form of a hymn, a confession of guilt seeking relief from suffering, or a request for a divine answer, it always rested on the same underlying beliefs that gave magic such an important place in religion. Omens belonged to this same system of thought. What linked incantations and omens was the deep sense of mystery that surrounded both human life and the natural world. In human experience, nothing appeared more mysterious than speech. The power to combine sounds into meaningful words set people apart and seemed to carry a force of its own. Authority itself depended on spoken commands, and the effectiveness of a leader's words reinforced the belief that speech possessed real power. From this mixture of wonder and experience came the idea that words could compel obedience, not only from people, but even from divine forces. Once this belief took shape, it became a permanent feature of religious practice. Even as religious thought developed and prayers grew more refined and expressive, the magical value of words did not disappear. The effectiveness of prayer still depended on being spoken correctly and by the proper person. In religious life, that role belonged to the priest. Just as authority in society rested with a ruler, authority in sacred matters rested with those who knew how to speak to the gods. The priest was believed to possess the knowledge needed to pronounce the right words in the right way, to perform the necessary rites, and to stand between humanity and the divine world. Even at a more advanced stage of religious culture, this position remained powerful. When incantations blended into formal prayers, or when prayers replaced them, the priest was still essential. Only through priestly mediation could requests be made effective, whether by adding intercession, performing rituals, or guiding the worshipper into the presence of the deity. Beyond the mystery of speech, the natural world inspired an even deeper sense of uncertainty. People were constantly reminded of their dependence on forces beyond their control. The sun, the moon, rain, and storms shaped survival. Animals could be dangerous or helpful, and every unusual event attracted attention. Anything that departed from the normal order suggested meaning. Since personal welfare was always at stake, both ordinary and extraordinary events were connected to human fate. Knowing what lay ahead seemed essential for survival. To see was to foresee, and the person who could recognize signs and understand them was believed to hold the key to the future. This attitude required constant alertness. The movement of stars and planets, changes in weather, eclipses, floods, earthquakes, winds, animal behavior, unusual births, strange physical marks, unexpected encounters, and even small sounds in nature were all watched carefully. Nothing was accidental. Every detail could signal future good or bad fortune. From this mindset emerged the vast omen literature of Babylonia and Assyria. A large portion of surviving texts consists of explanations of signs drawn from every possible aspect of life, from the heavens to the human body, from public affairs to private events. These omen texts were usually arranged into large series. Just as incantations and prayers were collected and ordered, so too were omens. One major group focused on the heavens. While the stars may also have served as guides for travel, the main reason for their careful observation was the belief that their movements carried messages for humanity. Astronomy developed as a tool for reading fate. Reports that appear scientific in tone were actually written with this purpose in mind. When astronomers informed kings about equinoxes, new moons, or eclipses, they were providing the raw material for interpretation. The balance of day and night at the equinox was treated as meaningful. The first sighting of the new moon was eagerly awaited each month and carefully reported. Eclipses received special attention. Scholars could predict when they might occur and watched closely. Whether an eclipse appeared or failed to appear was considered significant. These observations flowed easily into interpretation. A balanced sky could mean loyalty and long rule, while unusual conjunctions might signal danger, rebellion, or disaster. The moon occupied a central place because it governed time. Its changing phases structured weeks and months. Since it never appeared exactly the same on 2 consecutive nights, it offered endless variation. Variation itself was meaningful. The more change observed, the greater the potential significance. Past experiences were gathered and compared. If an event had once followed a certain lunar condition, that coincidence became a guide for the future. The same logic was applied to the sun, planets, and stars. Reports sometimes offered strikingly specific predictions. Unexpected appearances of the moon could foretell poor harvests or political submission. At other times, forecasts were more general, predicting famine, war, or prosperity. Not all predictions concerned politics. Some addressed agriculture, animals, or births. Still, the welfare of the state and the king remained the primary focus. Private life was included only insofar as it depended on public stability. Eclipses carried special weight because of their dramatic nature. They were rare and always suggested major upheaval. Large collections of eclipse omens were compiled, organized by month and by day. Each entry described the timing and appearance of the eclipse and linked it to the fate of a king, a foreign land, war, floods, famine, rebellion, or death. Even when an omen seemed tied to a specific region or ruler, it could be adapted to other situations. The goal was not precision, but usefulness. Alongside these specific entries were more general lists that predicted common outcomes such as rain, famine, unrest, or conflict. The vague character of many predictions was deliberate. Rain during certain seasons was likely. Military action was common. Floods, disease, and hardship were recurring features of life. By combining precise observations with broad expectations, the omen lists remained flexible and applicable to many situations. These collections were practical tools. When priests were asked whether a day was favorable for battle, construction, travel, marriage, or treatment of illness, they searched their accumulated records. Differences between days were explained by differences in the heavens. Night skies changed constantly, and these variations offered a framework for understanding why the same action could succeed at one time and fail at another. The planets attracted special attention because of their movement. Elevated temple towers may have served as observation platforms. Court astrologers held official positions, and records were kept at temples both large and small. Over time, planets were associated with major gods. These associations later passed into Greek and Roman tradition. Jupiter was linked with the supreme god, Venus with the great goddess, Mars with war and destruction, Mercury with wisdom and communication, and Saturn with discipline and judgment. Among these, Venus was especially important. Its disappearance and reappearance as evening or morning star were recorded in detail and linked to rain, war, prosperity, or unrest. Tablets preserved long sequences of observations, noting how long the planet vanished and under what conditions it returned. Each observation became a reference point. Once an omen was established, it could be reused indefinitely. The same methods applied to other planets and bright stars. Color, brightness, position, and movement all mattered. Comets were also included. Despite the variety of signs, the predicted outcomes revolved around a familiar set of concerns: crops, rain, war, peace, prosperity, and the fate of rulers. These practices reflected a worldview centered on communal life. The king and the state mattered more than individuals. Since agriculture dominated daily existence, reassurance about harvests and peace was enough for most people. War, especially in Assyria, reinforced a sense of shared fate. Public events bound society together, and the heavens were believed to speak most clearly about these larger matters. Through careful observation and accumulated tradition, Babylonian and Assyrian scholars sought to read those messages and guide the course of human action. In Babylonian and Assyrian omen traditions, the king and matters of state appear again and again for a clear reason. The ruler was seen as more than a political leader. He was believed to stand closer to the divine world than any ordinary person. Kingship was treated as a sacred office, granted by the gods themselves. When rulers claimed they had been chosen by a god, this was not simple flattery or ceremony. The king was understood as the god's representative on earth, the visible figure through whom divine favor could protect the land. In earlier times, royal power and priestly power were tightly bound together. The earliest Assyrian rulers even described themselves as priests of the chief god of their city. As kingdoms grew and government became more complex, responsibilities split. Priests developed into a separate class with their own authority, and the king no longer carried the full religious role on his own. Over time, this produced an interesting reversal. The king, once the one who acted directly in sacred matters, became increasingly dependent on priests in dealings with the gods. He could not simply demand an answer from the divine world whenever he wished. If guidance was needed, messengers had to be sent to the temple, and priests had to speak on the king's behalf. If the ruler feared divine anger, a priest had to plead for mercy. Even sacrifices offered by a king were thought to require priestly support in order to be fully accepted. Yet traces of the older bond remained. Sometimes a deity was believed to appear directly to a ruler through a dream and give guidance. More importantly, the king's religious behavior was treated as a matter of national survival. When an ordinary person offended a god, the punishment might fall on that person alone, or perhaps on the household. But when the king was believed to have sinned, the consequences could spread across the entire country. In that view, restoring harmony between ruler and gods was not private repentance. It was a public necessity, especially when disasters threatened the land. This belief shaped the idea of lucky and unlucky days. Certain days were feared or treated with extra caution. Some were considered good for ceremonies and major decisions, while others were considered dangerous. Part of this came from the fear of events tied to the lunar cycle, and part may have come from repeated memories of mishaps that seemed to cluster on particular dates. The result was a strong sense that time itself carried a different weight from day to day. Some days were suitable for celebration, others demanded restraint. On favorable days, the gods could be pleased through proper acts. On unfavorable days, great care was required to avoid provoking anger. To guide this behavior, special calendars were produced. These were not simple lists of dates. They were instruction manuals, day by day, telling what should be done and what should be avoided. Their main focus was the king. The logic was simple. If the king acted correctly at the right time, the whole people would benefit. One surviving calendar, created for an extra month added to the year, shows this clearly. Each day is linked to particular gods, and offerings or precautions are prescribed. A striking feature is that the text often calls every day favorable, even when it immediately describes strict restrictions, as if the wording expressed a hope or a method for turning danger into safety. On some days, the king is told to bring gifts and offer sacrifices so that prayers will be accepted. On other days, the instructions shift sharply into warnings. Certain days are labeled harmful. On those days, the ruler must avoid normal royal behavior. He must not wear fine clothing, must not eat certain foods, must not ride in ceremonial display, and must not hold court. Even priests are told not to seek an oracle for him in the innermost sacred space. Medical help may also be avoided, as if illness were viewed as a divine message that should not be challenged. Only after the day has passed can offerings be made in a way that will be accepted. In this system, the king's self-restraint is not personal discipline. It is protection for the land. A comparison naturally arises with the weekly day of rest in Hebrew tradition because both are tied to the lunar rhythm and both include prohibitions. But there is an important difference. In the Babylonian model, the burden falls mainly on the king. His holiness is treated as unique, and his careful conduct is believed to safeguard everyone. In the Hebrew model, the restrictions apply to the whole community. The Babylonian approach assumes the people are shielded by the ruler's ritual obedience, while the Hebrew approach treats the people as collectively responsible. These calendars also show how different gods were honored across the month. One day might be linked to a god of wisdom and his divine partner, another to a healing goddess, another to warlike powers, another to older divine figures. Across 30 days, most major deities appear in some form. The exact system behind these assignments is not always clear, and it likely varied from temple to temple. Each religious center would naturally emphasize its own chief deity and arrange the rest according to local tradition. Consistency was not the goal. The point was to provide practical guidance based on inherited belief and accumulated experience. Alongside the fuller calendars were shorter ones that read like quick notes. In these, each day receives only a word or two: hostility, favorable judgment, sorrow, gladness, forbidden intimacy, secret place. Such brief labels make sense only to those trained to understand them. A single word could indicate that the gods were unfriendly that day, or that it was a good time to seek an oracle, or that happiness would be risky, or that certain actions should be avoided. A mention of the secret place referred to the most restricted inner area of the temple, meaning that on that day entry was permitted or safe. Some calendars also included food prohibitions and everyday warnings. Certain foods were avoided on certain dates to prevent sickness. Some days were considered dangerous for crossing rivers, making deals, or conducting trade. Other days were described as good for military movement. These details sound popular, like folk belief in lucky and unlucky days, but they appear to have been gathered into official priestly guides and given formal authority. Even when the instructions could apply to ordinary people, the repeated focus on oracles, curses, weapons, and divine anger suggests that the main audience remained the court and its advisors. There were also calendars that judged entire months rather than individual days. These were designed for practical decisions, especially military ones. Certain months were marked as suitable for attacking an enemy city, while others were unsuitable. Some months were approved for marching into foreign territory, others discouraged. This kind of guide looks like it was made for a particular campaign, built from omen reasoning and intended to steer commanders toward the safest timing. All these materials point to the same basic pattern. Oracles, dreams, eclipse lists, star and planet reports, and daily calendars were built from the same habit of mind. People watched the world closely, remembered striking coincidences, and treated repeated patterns as meaningful. The priests gathered those patterns into lists and schedules so they could answer questions, advise rulers, and shape the king's behavior. The goal was always the same: to keep the ruler in harmony with the gods so that the land could remain under divine protection. And the sky was not the only source of signs. Everyday life provided endless material for interpretation. Unusual births, deformities, strange animal behavior, unexpected encounters, and rare events were all treated as messages. The rarer the event, the stronger the meaning attached to it. Thousands of tablets were devoted to these earthly signs. Some collections focused on unusual features in newborn children, others on abnormal births among animals, others on accidents and experiences that might happen in daily life, and still others on the movements of animals and birds. Birth signs were especially important. Even though births happened constantly, the appearance of new life remained mysterious. Omen texts listed countless variations in the body: ears, eyes, mouth, nose, limbs, fingers, toes, and more. Any unusual shape, any missing part, any extra digit, any strange resemblance to animals could be read as meaningful. Twins received special attention, especially when a birth involved unusual features. Some interpretations mixed private and public concerns. A sign might affect the household where the child was born, but more dramatic or rare features could be taken as warnings for the entire land or the ruler. The same approach was applied to the young of domestic animals. Since herds and livestock were central to survival, unusual births among them were treated seriously. Texts cataloged strange numbers of offspring, abnormal bodies, missing or misplaced features, and odd resemblances. These details were connected to outcomes such as famine, war, rebellion, prosperity, or the fall of a household. Sometimes the connection seems easy to follow, built on resemblance and symbolic thinking. Strength could be linked to lion-like features. Disorder in the body could be linked to disorder in the kingdom. At other times, the logic is difficult to trace because multiple layers of association were involved. Still, the overall structure shows that these interpretations were not random. They followed patterns that felt consistent within their worldview. Like producing like or likeness pointing to meaning was one guiding idea. The contrast between right and left was another, though it did not always work the same way in every case. In one line, the loss of a right side feature could signal good fortune, while elsewhere it could signal disaster, depending on what other factors were believed to matter. The system was flexible, layered, and shaped by tradition. By collecting endless variations, priests created handbooks designed to cover every possibility. The purpose was not to satisfy curiosity. It was to manage fear and uncertainty by turning strange events into readable signals. Whether the sign came from the sky, the calendar, a dream, a child, or an animal, it could be fitted into a framework of meaning. In that way, the future could be approached with the feeling that it was not completely unknown, but at least partly visible to those trained to interpret the signs. Lists of horse omens did not stop at simple defects. They ran through many unusual leg shapes and counted them one by one, treating each variation as a separate sign. Just as with newborn lambs, twin births among colts were seen as especially meaningful, as if a rare beginning automatically carried a heavy message about what would happen next. Some examples show how this thinking worked. When a mare was said to produce twins, a male and a female, and both had only one eye, the sign was read as disaster. Enemies would gain the upper hand and bring destruction. If either colt had a lion-like mane or a dog-like hoof, the meaning was tied to decline and contraction, as if the land itself would shrink. But if a colt showed a lion-like claw, the interpretation turned in the opposite direction, pointing to expansion and growing power. A dog-like head carried a dark message of hardship and loss, while a lion-like head suggested strength at the top of society. If both twins looked like lions, it meant dominance over rivals. If both looked like dogs, it could also be read as victory, though through a different symbolic route. Even a single colt resembling a lion was treated as a sign of a strong ruler, while a colt resembling a dog could signal famine and the death of herds. Other extreme images appeared as well. A colt without a head could be interpreted as strength for the owner. A colt without eyes could imply a change in leadership. A colt without feet suggested military growth and bloodshed. A colt without ears pointed to years of decline, and a colt without a tail was read as death for the ruler. These interpretations were not driven only by the shock of seeing something abnormal. Older myth shaped the way such signs were understood. In many ancient cultures, stories and images of mixed creatures were common, beings formed from parts of different animals. Temple gates and palace approaches were guarded by monstrous figures that made this idea feel real and visible. So, when a young animal appeared to carry a feature that belonged to another creature, the sight could be taken as proof that such mixtures were possible. In a vague but powerful way, it also supported a broad feeling that the animal world was linked together. Many creatures resembled one another, and humans shared traits with animals too. From that perspective, it seemed natural to imagine that in some distant age the boundaries were not fixed, and that life had once been blended in strange combinations. Religious imagination and everyday observation reinforced each other, giving hybrid births extra weight. From there, the same habit of interpretation spread beyond birth signs into the actions of animals. Many ancient societies treated certain animals as sacred in two different ways at once. A creature could be protected from harm because it carried a dangerous power, and that same dangerous power could make it something to avoid. The pig and the dog show this double idea. In some regions, the pig was treated as special, which helped explain why certain communities refused to eat it at particular times, while others avoided it completely. The dog, meanwhile, was often viewed as unclean in daily life, but still not to be injured. That combination made it a strong candidate for omen reading. It could signal good or bad, depending on what it did, where it appeared, and even what color it was. Texts describing dogs present a clear pattern. When a dog entered a palace, the meaning was often tied to the fate of the court. A yellow dog could signal suffering ahead. A speckled dog might point toward peace with an enemy. If a dog entered and was killed, it could mean that calm would be broken. If it crept onto a couch or near a throne, it was read as a warning that comfort and stability would vanish. But if it lay on a large bowl, the same animal could become a sign that peace would be secured. Similar readings were applied when dogs entered temples. A plain dog could imply that the land would not grow. A white dog might mean the temple's foundations would stand firm, while a black dog suggested weakness. Other colors were tied to justice or divine favor. If many dogs gathered and entered together, it was treated as a warning that the city's peace would be shaken. The same logic reached into private life. A dog crossing into a household could be read as a warning of destruction by fire. Defilement was treated even more seriously. If a dog soiled a person, the meaning changed with the dog's color. One could point to ruin, another to sickness, another to death. If a dog soiled bedding, a harsh illness was expected. If it defiled a chair, the year might be the last. If it defiled a bowl, divine anger was feared. Yet dogs were not meant to disappear from public roads. Their absence from the highway itself could be read as a bad sign, as if a city without dogs was exposed to attack. Other creatures mattered too. Ancient writers describe attention given to serpents, birds, and insects, and this fits well with a world where danger could rise from many directions. Serpents inspired fear because they appeared and vanished mysteriously and moved in strange ways. Insects such as locusts were terrifying because they could erase food supplies, while scorpions were feared for their sting. Birds were watched for signs in their flight, and certain birds became especially important. A raven entering a house could be treated as a promise that desires would be fulfilled. A bird dropping meat or an object into a home could be read as the arrival of wealth. When flocks gathered inside a city, the meaning was often public rather than personal, and birds entering a temple could be interpreted as affecting the whole land. A key principle ran through this system. Signs that appeared to one person were usually treated as personal omens. A snake met on a walk, a scorpion found in a field, or the behavior of animals in a private stall tended to be interpreted as affecting the individual or the household. But when an event unfolded in a public place or on a large scale, the meaning widened to include the city or the state. A bull crouching at a city gate was read as a threat to that gate. A bull attacking another animal in the streets was treated as a warning for the city, while the same animal entering a private yard could be taken as favorable for that household. Locust omens show the same pattern. When insects appeared inside a man's house, the signs were aimed directly at the master of that home. Death, collapse of supports, destruction, distress, bad luck, and ruin. The same creatures in the wider town could imply trouble for the community. Dreams were treated as part of the same reality. Seeing something while asleep was often considered even more significant than seeing it by day. Dreams were thought to be sent, and special divine powers were associated with them. This opened an enormous field for interpretation because the mind could produce endless images at night. If a lion appeared in a dream, it could mean success in reaching a goal. A jackal could mean gaining divine favor. A dog could mean sorrow. Other animals could be linked to death or loss within the family. Strange images were also read symbolically, such as objects appearing on a person's head. A date could mean distress, a fish could mean power, a mountain could mean having no equal, salt could mean protection for the household. Visions of the dead and terrifying beings were also catalogued and given meanings. Stories from later traditions that place dream interpretation in Babylonian settings reflect the reputation this system gained, and it is noticeable how often such dream narratives revolve around animals, just like the omen lists do. Alongside dream signs were countless everyday omens tied to ordinary experiences. A wide range of events could be treated as meaningful: work in the field, trade, travel by land or sea, family matters, sickness, death, accidents, and even the condition of a house wall. A crack in a wall could be a sign, dropping a tool could be a sign, falling could be a sign, meeting an animal on the road could be a sign. It was hard to name anything that could not be read as a message. Some of these readings were clearly personal, especially those connected to illness. Even bodily symptoms were turned into predictions, and the meaning could change depending on whether a sign appeared on the right side or the left. This huge body of signs shows a boundary line in the system. When a phenomenon affected one person or was seen by one person alone, the consequences were usually limited to that person and the immediate circle around him. But when the sign touched a wider space, appeared in a public setting, or seemed large enough to concern the whole community, it was drawn into the fate of the ruler and the state. This also reveals how strongly such beliefs could shape behavior. If certain times, places, or encounters were considered dangerous, people would try to avoid them. If other signs were considered favorable, people would try to arrange life so that those signs appeared more often. Perfect success was impossible, but even partial success could feel like protection. The result was a daily and nightly awareness of dependence on unseen powers. Life could become a continuous effort to read signals, avoid danger, and secure good fortune. When misfortune came anyway, and it often did, the final response was to seek mercy from the gods. Divine powers could soften harsh signs, overturn bad expectations, and turn fear into hope, because the same forces believed to send warnings were also believed to be able to change their meaning.